Here are 3 hours of impossible aviation journeys, where planes entered the skies and returned with stories that defy reason. In August 1947, a Douglas DC-4 traced its path across the Andes. At 3:30 p.m., it reported its position near Santiago. Minutes later, silence. Searchers scoured snowfields, valleys, and glaciers. Nearly 50 years later, climbers uncovered metal protruding from ice as though the aircraft had been waiting. The Andes have always carried an air of quiet menace. Towering peaks rise above 20 feet, their slopes shifting under avalanches and storms that arrive without warning. Pilots who flew the route between Buenos Aires and Santiago in the 1940s knew its dangers well. Yet the DC-4 that departed on that August afternoon had every reason to expect success. The weather was clear. Winds were favourable. Its captain, Robert L. Lindquist, was experienced, trusted by his crew and passengers alike. The aircraft carried 36 souls. Families, businessmen, and travellers hoping to cross one of South America's most unforgiving corridors. Early in the flight, radio reports were routine. Lindquist's voice was steady, giving estimated arrival times, describing calm conditions. Then, at 3:30 p.m., the final message was logged. No hint of trouble, no word of storm, only position and time. Minutes later, silence. The disappearance set in motion a desperate search. Argentine, Chilean, and American forces joined efforts, sweeping ridgelines with aircraft and sending ground teams deep into glacial passes. For days, searchers combed valleys and white slopes, hoping for the metallic glint of fuselage or the faint trail of smoke. Nothing appeared. Reports filtered in from shepherds and mountaineers, a flash of light in the sky, a sound like thunder echoing against stone, but no verifiable evidence surfaced. Weeks turned to months. The case was gradually closed. Officially, the DC-4 had gone down somewhere in the mountains, its wreckage unrecoverable in the sheer immensity of the Andes. For the families, closure never came. Without bodies, without debris, grief lingered in suspension. It wasn't until 1995, nearly half a century later, that climbers ascending Mount Tupungato, east of Santiago, stumbled across something that the mountain had concealed for decades. A twisted fragment of metal, unmistakably manufactured. Closer inspection revealed parts of an engine, clothing preserved by the cold, and even scraps of paper still legible. The ice had acted as a time capsule, sealing away the wreckage until gravity slowly carried it back toward the surface. The discovery confirmed what had long been suspected. The DC-4 had flown into the mountain itself. Analysts concluded that Lindquist may have begun his descent too early, convinced he had already cleared the highest peaks. A sudden veil of cloud, invisible on approach, could have hidden the wall of rock until impact was unavoidable. And yet, the evidence raised as many questions as it answered. Items recovered from the glacier fabrics, documents, even parts of uniforms appeared startlingly intact, as though decades had not passed at all. The preservation was explained by the cold. But for those who touched the objects, it felt as if time itself had paused. Moreover, searchers in 1947 had combed this very region. Why had no wreckage been found then? How could entire engines and sections of fuselage remain invisible to teams on foot and in aircraft? Some suggest shifting glaciers concealed the wreck immediately after impact, hiding it beneath tons of snow and ice. Others whisper of stranger forces that the plane slipped, however briefly, into another fold of time before the mountain revealed its secret. Local folklore supports such notions. For generations, stories have circulated of travelers who vanish into mists and emerge hours or days later, unaware of time lost. The Andes, with their peaks and valleys, are often described as liminal spaces, thresholds where the natural and the otherworldly blur. Today, pieces of the DC-4 still emerge from the glacier, carried down slowly by ice that moves like a river over centuries. Each fragment is a reminder of the lives lost and of the mystery that kept them hidden for so long. For the families, the wreckage provided bittersweet closure. But the silence surrounding those final minutes, the absence of a distress call, the suddenness of the disappearance, and the mountain's long refusal to yield its truth, leaves questions lingering in the thin air above Tupungato, and as climbers continue to find fragments of that ill-fated aircraft, one thought remains. If the Andes can hold a plane for nearly 50 years, what other secrets might still be locked in ice, waiting to return? On December 5, 1945, 5 Avenger bombers lifted from Fort Lauderdale, their engines steady under a pale afternoon Sunday. Within hours, their radio transmissions grew fragmented, compasses spun wildly, and the formation slipped silently into the Atlantic. No wreckage was ever recovered, yet the last static-laced call suggested something stranger than navigational error. It began as a routine training mission, the kind that naval aviators had flown countless times before. Designated as Flight 19, the exercise was simple on paper. A triangular route stretching east from Florida, turning north over the Atlantic, then back west to base. Each aircraft carried 3 men, experienced crews who knew both the terrain and their machines. Weather reports predicted favourable skies, with only scattered clouds and calm seas. By every measure, it should have been uneventful. But just after 3:0 p.m., the first hints of disorientation slipped into the transmissions. Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, the squadron leader, radioed that both of his compasses were malfunctioning. He was convinced they had flown too far south, over the Florida Keys, and were now heading into the Gulf of Mexico. In reality, records placed them hundreds of miles northeast of where Taylor believed they were. For the next hour, radio operators strained to make sense of fragments breaking through static. Voices overlapped, uncertain, sometimes panicked. Taylor's tone shifted from confidence to doubt. "We don't know where we are," he repeated. "The ocean doesn't look right." Crews on the ground urged him to turn west, toward the setting Sunday. Yet Taylor's transmissions hinted at something more unsettling. He said they could not tell which way was west. As daylight drained into evening, the voices grew faint. Static swallowed syllables, words collapsed into fragments. The final coherent transmission recorded in naval logs was brief. "Everything looks strange. We can't make out land." After that, silence. The Navy launched one of the largest search operations in history. More than 300 aircraft and dozens of ships combed over 250 square miles of ocean. Not a single piece of debris was recovered. Even more haunting, one of the PBM Mariner rescue planes dispatched to locate Flight 19 also vanished within an hour of takeoff. Witnesses aboard a tanker claimed they saw a bright fireball descending into the sea, yet no wreckage of the Mariner was ever found. Explanations ranged from the mundane to the extraordinary. Some suggested that strong currents in the Gulf Stream dragged any floating wreckage far from the search area. Others pointed to Taylor's insistence that they were flying over the Keys, arguing that his navigational error doomed them. Skeptics highlight the Avenger's limited fuel range without a correct heading. They would have eventually ditched into the sea. And yet, the mystery refuses to settle into certainty. Why did multiple compasses fail simultaneously? Why did Taylor describe the ocean as looking strange? Crews familiar with the Atlantic do not confuse it with the shallow waters of the Gulf. And why did the rescue plane vanish so suddenly, without distress calls, echoing the fate of the men it had been sent to save? Over the years, theories have multiplied. Some point to electromagnetic anomalies in the Bermuda Triangle, where reports of compass malfunctions stretch back centuries. Others speculate about time slips, atmospheric corridors where hours or even days vanish. Pilots across decades have described sudden whiteouts, walls of cloud that shimmer, instruments spinning wildly before clearing into skies that seem... But the truth remains elusive. The final words of Flight 19 still echo through naval records. Static-laced, fragmented, uncertain. They hint at disorientation not just of navigation, but of reality itself. What those 14 men saw above the Atlantic that December afternoon may never be fully understood. And yet, long after the engines faded into silence, the mystery lingers, a flight path that never closed, a journey that continues somewhere beyond the horizon. July 1955. A routine New York to Miami flight lifted with 57 passengers aboard. It vanished without a trace. Decades later, in Caracas, Venezuela, controllers logged a DC-4 bearing Pan Am livery long retired, its pilot calmly asking clearance from 1,955. The morning had begun without incident at New York's LaGuardia Airport. Pan American Flight 914, a Douglas DC-4, stood gleaming on the tarmac beneath the midsummer Sunday. Families hugged goodbye. Businessmen checked their watches, and the crew of 4 moved through routine pre-flight checks. The 3-hour journey south to Miami was considered straightforward, with clear skies predicted along the entire East Coast. At 9:55 a.m., the silver fuselage lifted into the sky. Controllers tracked its steady progress over the coastline. Radio transmissions were calm and unremarkable. Then, somewhere between New Jersey and Florida, the blip disappeared from radar. No distress call, no sign of mechanical failure, no deviation from its course. It was as if the aircraft had been erased mid-flight. Search and rescue missions swept the waters off the Atlantic coast. Hundreds of square miles were covered by ships and aircraft, but no debris, oil slicks, or bodies surfaced. In official reports, Pan Am could only confirm that Flight 914 had failed to arrive and was presumed lost. For decades, the disappearance was relegated to the long list of aviation mysteries. But in 1992, 37 years later, air traffic controllers in Caracas, Venezuela, picked up an inbound signal. The radar showed an approaching aircraft, but its transponder code matched no current flight. When contact was established, the voice was calm, professional, and deeply unsettling. "This is Pan American Flight 914 from New York to Miami, requesting permission to land." Controllers stared at one another. Pan Am had ceased operations the year before, in 1991. The flight number belonged to a craft lost before most of the staff were even born. Yet on the runway, the plane came into view, its paintwork faded, its livery decades out of date. The DC-4 touched down and taxied toward the gate. Ground crews noted details that seemed impossible. The uniforms worn by the pilots, the furnishings inside the cabin, even the printed materials scattered in the cockpit, all belonged to the mid-1950s. And yet, the passengers visible through the windows appeared calm, unaware that the year was no longer 1955. When the pilot rolled down his window to speak with ground staff, he reportedly asked a simple, chilling question. "What year is this?" The answer, 1992, drained the colour from his face. Without further explanation, he restarted the engines, turned back toward the runway, and took off. Attempts to intercept the aircraft failed. Within minutes, it had vanished into the clouds. All that remained were a handful of loose papers said to have blown from the cockpit during the brief stop. Among them, a passenger manifest matching the names of those lost in 1955 and a calendar from the same year. Official logs from the airport were later reported missing, altered, or sealed. Explanations vary. Skeptics argue the entire story originated in sensationalist magazines and was perpetuated through decades of retelling, blending fact with folklore. They note the absence of verified passenger accounts or surviving crew testimony. Without physical wreckage, it is difficult to treat the incident as historical fact. Yet for many, the story lingers because of its symmetry with other unexplained cases. Time slips, corridors of atmospheric distortion, or even electromagnetic anomalies have all been proposed. Could Flight 914 have entered such a corridor in 1955, emerging 37 years later, without its passengers realizing a moment had passed? The unanswered question lies not in whether the story is literal truth, but in why it persists with such consistency. Families of the vanished, aviation historians, and curious minds all return to the same haunting image. A silver DC-4 lifting into the air in 1955, only to appear decades later as though no time had passed. The plane is gone again now, destination unknown. But its story continues to circulate, whispered in hangars, classrooms, and control towers, because if one aircraft can leave its own time behind, what other journeys might still be unfolding in the skies above us? 4 RAF biplanes rose in perfect formation above France. Clear skies, experienced pilots, calm air. They were never seen again, Decades later, commercial pilots described antique planes gliding silently across modern skies, immaculate, steady, vanishing into low cloud. It was late summer, 1918. The First World War was entering its final brutal months. Across northern France, skies buzzed with aircraft of all kinds: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes. Yet the 4 biplanes that lifted from their airfield that morning were not bound for combat. Their mission was routine, a short training loop designed to keep young pilots sharp in formation, flying and navigation. The aircraft were identical, Royal Air Force machines with their distinctive roundel markings on fabric wings stretched taut over wooden frames, each man strapped into an open cockpit, goggles tightened against the slipstream, leather jackets creaking in the morning air. The weather was perfect: bright skies, gentle winds, and visibility stretching for miles. The squadron formed a diamond in the sky, climbing steadily over the rolling fields of France. Observers in the control tower logged their heading and anticipated return time. Nothing suggested danger, yet hours passed, and the biplanes failed to reappear. When radio calls brought no response, search parties were dispatched. Other pilots retraced the intended route. Ground teams combed the fields and villages beneath. No crash sites, no reports of downed aircraft, no witnesses to explosions or fire. The 4 biplanes had simply vanished. In wartime, explanations were always sought quickly. Enemy interception was considered, but German forces were not active in that area on that day. Weather was discounted. There were no storms, no clouds heavy enough to conceal 4 aircraft. Mechanical failure seemed unlikely too. What were the chances of all 4 machines suffering breakdown simultaneously, with no pilot managing an emergency landing? The case was quietly filed away as one of the countless tragedies of war. Families received little more than the official words: missing, presumed dead. But the story did not end there. In the years that followed, reports began to surface strange fragmented accounts of old aircraft, seen where none should have been. Farmers in rural France described the low drone of engines, only to look up and see biplanes flying in formation, their paintwork pristine despite the passage of decades. Some said the planes banked sharply into banks of mist and never emerged. Even more compelling were the testimonies of professional aviators. In the 1930s, an airline pilot crossing the English Channel reported 4 vintage biplanes flying alongside him. So close he could clearly make out their markings. They held formation perfectly, wings level and steady. He reached for the radio, but before he could establish contact, the aircraft turned into a low cloud and disappeared. When he checked with air traffic control, no military flights were recorded in the area. Accounts like this continued well into the 1950s and 1960s. Each described the same formation: 4 planes, immaculate in appearance, gliding silently and unnaturally smoothly for machines of their age. Witnesses noted the absence of turbulence, the uncanny steadiness of their flight, and always their sudden vanishing into cloud. Skeptics argued the sightings were misinterpretations, perhaps modern planes mistaken for antiques, or even staged air shows. Yet the consistency across decades troubled even hardened investigators. Different witnesses, separated by time and geography, described the same details. Among believers, one explanation persists: that the squadron somehow slipped out of its own time during that morning in 1918, caught in a loop that occasionally intersects with ours. Unlike other disappearances, these pilots did not simply vanish forever. Instead, they appear and reappear, bound to a moment that has not finished unfolding. For the families of the missing men, no wreckage meant no closure. Photographs of smiling young pilots in leather helmets remained on mantels, their fates unresolved. And for those who claimed to glimpse the squadron years later, the experience was unforgettable. A fleeting brush with history, alive and airborne, yet out of reach. To this day, stories of the Ghost Squadron continue to circulate in aviation circles. They are spoken of quietly, usually with a tone of unease, because if the skies can hold a squadron suspended between eras, then perhaps time itself is not as fixed as we believe, and somewhere above the clouds, 4 biplanes may still be flying steady, silent, waiting. In the 1980s, airline operators scanning emergency frequencies captured a voice repeating distress calls. Its call sign matched a flight lost decades earlier, clear, desperate, but impossible. The logs were entered, but the plane in question had long ceased to exist. Aviation relies on strict radio discipline. Every pilot, every controller knows that certain frequencies are reserved exclusively for emergencies. Channel 121.5. MHz, known simply as GUARD, is monitored across the globe. It is the last lifeline of any aircraft in distress, the place where final words are heard. So, when operators in Europe and North America began recording faint distress signals on GUARD in the early 1980s, the transmissions drew immediate attention. The voice was male, firm at first, then frayed with urgency. He identified his aircraft, gave position reports, and requested immediate assistance. To seasoned operators, his cadence felt authentic. Clipped sentences, technical detail, the unmistakable strain of a professional aviator in trouble. But one detail froze the blood of those who listened. The call sign belonged to a flight that had disappeared in the 1940s. The initial assumption was interference, perhaps a hoax or bleed over from another channel. Yet as recordings were reviewed, doubts deepened. The aircraft designation, a Douglas transport lost over the Atlantic, had not been used in decades. The coordinates given, though imprecise, placed the plane somewhere over ocean routes where no traffic was present. And most unsettling of all, the logs recorded the pilot repeating phrases that matched transcripts preserved in historical archives from the day the flight had vanished. Reports spread quietly among airline crews and amateur radio enthusiasts. Some claimed to have captured snippets of the same transmission themselves. Static-laced, distorted, but always carrying the same desperate plea: Mayday, Mayday. This is, followed by the call sign long retired. No new information, no updates. Just a loop, as though a moment from the past had broken free and was echoing endlessly. The phenomenon wasn't entirely unprecedented. Radio engineers have long documented the strange persistence of signals known as long-delayed echoes. In rare conditions, a transmission can bounce between layers of the ionosphere and return minutes, even hours, later. But decades? No known physics explains a signal vanishing in 1948 and resurfacing in 1980 with its clarity intact. Skeptics leaned on other explanations. Perhaps the recordings were elaborate fabrications, coincidences of misheard words, or deliberate pranks by skilled operators. Yet those who had been present during the live receptions pushed back. They described the raw chill of hearing a voice that did not belong to their time. The strain of an aviator convinced his engines were failing, the hopelessness carried in syllables that modern pilots recognized instantly. And then, just as suddenly as they began, the transmission ceased. By the late 1980s, no further reports surfaced. The phantom SOS faded back into silence, leaving behind only archived tapes and handwritten logs. To this day, the tapes are studied by enthusiasts searching for anomalies in the waveforms. Some note background static patterns that do not match 1980s radio signatures, but instead resemble equipment of the mid-20th century. Others argue the voice patterns reveal stress markers consistent with genuine emergency communication, far too subtle for hoaxers to replicate. But beyond analysis lies the deeper, more unsettling possibility. What if the pilot's voice did not simply echo, but was still transmitting caught in a corridor of time where distress calls never end, repeating forever on an endless loop until someone listens? For families of those lost decades earlier, the thought is almost unbearable. Their loved ones' final moments suspended, replaying across time. Yet for those who sat in dim control rooms and heard the impossible with their own ears, there is no easy dismissal. Somewhere, between static and silence, a voice may still be calling. Liverpool, 1990s. A retired police officer crossed Bold Street on his way to a bookstore. Yet, as his steps carried him forward, shop fronts shifted, cars vanished, and the street filled with fashions of another century. His name was Frank. Years on the force had trained him to observe detail without embellishment. That summer morning, he and his wife had arranged to meet at Waterstones, a well-known bookstore near the city centre. Arriving slightly ahead of schedule, Frank decided to stroll the familiar pavement, the hum of traffic and chatter of shoppers filling the air around him. But as he stepped from one curb to the next, the atmosphere changed. The sound of engines faded. Voices softened. Replaced by a muffled quiet, he looked up, and the world no longer matched the late 20th century. Shop fronts displayed wooden facades with polished brass handles. Signs bore names long absent from the city, and where modern vehicles had lined the road, horse-drawn carts rattled along cobblestones. At first, Frank thought it was some kind of elaborate street performance. Liverpool was known for its cultural festivals, and reenactments weren't unheard of, but the details unsettled him. The air smelled different coal smoke, leather, dust. People passed him in tailored suits, long skirts, and hats pulled tight against the Sunday. Their movements weren't theatrical, they were natural, unaware of anything unusual. Instinctively, Frank reached for the nearest landmark. The bookstore. But Waterstones was gone. In its place stood Cripps, a fabric shop that had closed in the 1960s. The name shone clearly above the doorway, painted in a style he recognized only from old photographs. Confused, he quickened his pace. And then, without warning, the spell broke. A bus roared past, its brakes squealing. Shoppers hurried by, carrying plastic bags. Waterstones stood before him once again. The moment had lasted less than a minute, yet Frank's pulse hammered as if he'd walked into another life. When he told his wife, she listened with skepticism. But in the years that followed, Frank was not alone. Dozens of others reported similar experiences on Bold Street. One woman, browsing for a cafe, found herself suddenly standing outside a milk bar. The kind popular in the 1940s. Another described entering a shop, handling goods on its shelves, only to find herself alone in an empty, derelict building moments later. Local historians cross-checked the accounts. Many matched records of businesses that had indeed stood on Bold Street decades earlier. Names, colours, even window displays were described in detail by witnesses too young to have known them. Scientists who studied the phenomenon pointed to psychological explanations. Memory slips, déjà vu, or the brain misfiring under stress. Yet the consistency of the reports made them harder to dismiss. Some suggested Bold Street might rest on unusual geological or electromagnetic conditions, creating distortions in human perception. Others whispered of time slips, spontaneous crossings into layers of the past that linger like echoes in certain locations. For Frank, the experience remained vivid for the rest of his life. He described it not with drama, but with the steady voice of a man trained to separate fact from imagination. He hadn't dreamed. He hadn't imagined. He had walked, for a moment, in another Liverpool, and Bold Street's reputation endures. Even today, passers-by speak of strange sensations, a sudden hush, a flicker in the corner of the eye, a shop front that doesn't match the present. Most shrug it off. A few stop, uneasy, wondering if they've just brushed against another time. The street carries on as usual, bustling, modern, full of life. But beneath its cobblestones lies a question with no answer. How many lives are unfolding there, layered one upon the other, waiting for someone to step across? And if it can happen on Bold Street, how many other places hide the same thin doorway between centuries? June 23rd, 1950. Northwest Airlines Flight 2501 disappeared en route to Minneapolis. Radio contact ended abruptly over Lake Michigan. Though oil slicks were sighted, not a single body or fuselage fragment was ever recovered. Sonar scans decades later revealed nothing. That summer evening, the Douglas DC-4 lifted from New York's LaGuardia Airport just after 7:30 p.m. Its destination was Seattle, with scheduled stops in Minneapolis and Spokane. On board were 55 passengers and 3 crew, a routine long-haul service on a trusted aircraft. The DC-4 was considered reliable, sturdy, capable of carrying large loads over long distances. Captain Robert Lind, a respected pilot with thousands of hours logged, was at the controls. As night fell, weather began to shift. A line of storms stretched across the Midwest, bringing turbulence, lightning, and heavy winds. At 11:13 p.m. As the aircraft crossed over Lake Michigan, Captain Lind radioed a request to descend from 3,500 feet to 2,500, citing severe weather and rough air. Permission was denied due to traffic in the area. Minutes later, controllers logged the final communication. After that, silence. When Flight 2501 failed to arrive in Minneapolis, the largest search effort in the region's history was launched. Hundreds of boats scoured the surface of Lake Michigan. Aircraft circled overhead. Within hours, searchers spotted an oil slick stretching across the water. Small fragments of upholstery and insulation were recovered, yet no fuselage, no bodies, and no major wreckage were ever located. Theories circulated quickly. Some investigators believed the DC-4 had been struck by lightning or overwhelmed by turbulence, breaking apart in the storm. Others suggested the pilot may have been disoriented by conflicting radar returns and descending winds, forcing the aircraft down into the lake. Yet without debris, the truth remained elusive. Over the following weeks, divers attempted to locate the wreckage. Lake Michigan, however, held its silence. Its depths dropped sharply to more than 900 feet, its waters opaque and shifting. Despite sonar sweeps, nothing conclusive was ever found. The families of the 58 lost were left with little more than speculation. For decades, the mystery lingered quietly. Then, in the early 2000s, renewed searches brought hope. Advanced sonar equipment was deployed by teams determined to locate the wreck. Patterns of the lakebed were mapped, anomalies investigated. A handful of wrecks were indeed discovered, but none belonged to Flight 2501. They were earlier ships and planes, long forgotten beneath the waves. The DC-4 remained missing. Some researchers turned to folklore. Lake Michigan is home to what locals call the Michigan Triangle, a swath of water linked to shipwrecks, missing vessels, and unexplained aerial disappearances. Sailors have long described strange lights, sudden storms, and compasses spinning wildly in its vicinity. Could Flight 2501 have been drawn into one of these anomalies? Witness accounts added another layer. That night, residents along the lakeshore reported hearing a massive explosion above the water, followed by silence. Others claimed to have seen red lights descending rapidly toward the lake. None of these reports were ever confirmed. Yet they echoed eerily with the silence on radio frequencies, an aircraft in distress, unseen, untraceable. Today, dedicated groups like the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association continue to search for the lost DC-4. Each summer, sonar sweeps comb the depths. Each season brings new discoveries, but never the aircraft itself. More than 70 years on, the lake holds its secret. The absence of wreckage remains the most haunting detail. In most crashes, even catastrophic ones, fragments rise, bodies surface, and evidence spreads. But in the case of Flight 2501, the water gave back only scraps. No engines, no wings, no evidence sufficient to close the case. For families, the unresolved fate of their loved ones stretches into the present. And for those who live along the shores of Lake Michigan, the night sky still carries whispers of a plane that vanished into storm and silence. Perhaps it lies deep beneath the silt, waiting for discovery. Or perhaps, like so many before it, Flight 2501 slipped into a corridor of time where its journey continues still. Known as the Hump, supply flights over the Himalayas were perilous in World War II. Yet one C-47's final message in 1943 was chilling. Its pilot described a wall of cloud, solid as stone. Radar lost the blip moments later. By 1943, the Allied war effort in Asia depended on a fragile aerial lifeline. Japanese forces had cut off ground supply routes into China, forcing the Allies to rely on air corridors over the Himalayas. Pilots called it the Hump, a jagged passage where peaks rose above 0 feet, and weather could shift from calm to catastrophic in minutes. The men who flew it often described the route as more dangerous than enemy fire. On a late spring afternoon, one C-47 transport plane departed from Assam, India, its cargo hold packed with supplies. The crew was experienced. They had flown the route before, knew the turbulence, the risk of icing, and the sudden downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into unseen ridges. But as they pushed deeper into the mountains, the flight took a strange turn. At 47 hours, the pilot radioed an unusual report. Instead of storm bands or heavy turbulence, he described approaching what looked like a wall of cloud but with the solidity of stone. "We can't go through it," he said. "It looks solid." Seconds later, the transmission ended mid-sentence. Radar contact vanished. Search crews were dispatched immediately. Dozens of aircraft traced the flight's last known coordinates. Ground teams trekked into valleys and along treacherous ridgelines. For weeks, they scoured glaciers and ravines. But the mountains yielded nothing. No twisted metal, no signal fires, no parachutes. It was as though the plane had been absorbed into the vast silence of the Himalayas. The disappearance wasn't isolated. More than 500 aircraft were lost along the hump during the war, victims of weather, terrain, or enemy fire. But this case carried peculiar weight. The pilot's words, "a wall of cloud, solid as stone," were unlike anything logged in other final transmissions. And unlike many crashes where wreckage was eventually recovered, this C-47 never reappeared. Decades later, mountaineers in Tibet reported finding fragments of Allied aircraft emerging from receding glaciers. Some were identified, their serial numbers matched to long-lost flights. Yet none belonged to the crew who described the wall of cloud. Their plane and their bodies remain missing. Scientists proposed natural explanations. The Himalayas are notorious for producing lenticular clouds, smooth lens-shaped formations that hang motionless against the sky. Under certain light, they can appear unnaturally solid, like walls or domes. Pilots unfamiliar with their optical tricks may have mistaken them for impenetrable barriers. Others point to sudden downdrafts, which can exceed 60 feet per minute, dragging a plane down before a distress call can be made. But the strangeness of the pilot's phrasing lingers. Experienced aviators rarely describe clouds as solid. His tone, captured in surviving transcripts, suggested something beyond meteorology, a genuine belief that they were facing an obstacle not of vapor, but of substance. Whispers among veterans of the hump flight speak of stranger things still. Aircraft that seemed to lose hours in transit, compasses that spun without cause, pilots who swore they saw lights pacing their wings high above the mountains. In a place where weather, altitude, and atmosphere collide, some believe thin places exist corridors where time and perception unravel. The missing C-47 became one of those stories passed quietly among crews long after the war ended. Not just another casualty of the mountains, but a reminder that some flights vanish into more than just terrain and weather. Today, the glaciers continue to shift, revealing secrets of aircraft entombed for decades. Each season brings new discoveries, a fragment of fuselage here, a dog tag there. Yet the transport that described the wall of cloud has not returned. Somewhere in the Himalayas, beneath snow and silence, it may still rest. Or perhaps, as its final words suggested, it passed into something else entirely, a wall that was never meant to be crossed. A British pilot landing near Edinburgh in 1935 described an unfamiliar, brightly lit airfield. Yet, when he returned weeks later, the location was farmland. Decades after, an airport was built matching the description he gave. The pilot in question was Sir Victor Goddard, an officer in the Royal Air Force with a career marked by discipline and detail. By the mid-1930s, he had logged countless hours in the cockpit. On a routine flight between Andover and Edinburgh, he encountered something that would trouble him for the rest of his life. Approaching the Scottish capital, Goddard descended toward what he believed was Turnhouse Aerodrome, a familiar landing strip on the outskirts of the city. But as he neared the ground, something felt wrong. The field appeared unusually bright, illuminated by lights that cast a strange clarity over the tarmac. Instead of the small, modest outpost he knew, the airfield seemed transformed. Rows of hangars lined the edges. 4-engine bombers stood parked along the taxiways, painted in camouflage schemes Goddard had never seen before. Ground crews moved with precision, their uniforms blue instead of the khaki standard of the day. Even the runways looked modernized, paved, orderly and marked, unlike the grass strips that characterized the 1930s. Startled, Goddard lifted away from the scene and circled again. From above, it was unmistakable. An advanced airbase, fully operational, yet no such facility existed on the maps he carried. Convinced he had misidentified the location, he climbed and set course to Edinburgh proper. When he retraced his path days later, the airfield was gone. Turnhouse remained the same modest grass strip it had always been. No bombers, no blue uniformed ground crews, no paved runways. What he had seen, it seemed, was impossible. Weeks passed, and Goddard's experience might have faded into memory except that it did not. The vision stayed with him, sharp in detail, impossible to dismiss. Then, years later, during the Second World War, the truth began to take shape. Turnhouse Aerodrome was expanded into a major Royal Air Force base. Concrete runways were laid, new hangars rose along its perimeter. Aircraft painted in camouflage patterns, nearly identical to those Goddard had described, lined the airfield. And the uniforms of ground crews? They had indeed changed from khaki to blue. Every detail of his strange landing, in 1935, matched the airfield as it appeared nearly a decade later. The account baffled colleagues. Goddard was not a man prone to exaggeration. He was respected, rational, and experienced. His later writings confirm he considered the event a genuine time slip, a moment where the present fractured and the future bled through. Skeptics suggested alternative explanations. Others argued his vision was a product of fatigue, a waking dream induced by the monotony of flight. Yet the precision of his description, down to paint schemes and uniforms not yet introduced, strained those explanations thin. The phenomenon of phantom airfields has appeared elsewhere in aviation folklore. Pilots have reported runways that vanish upon approach, control towers in places that never existed, and lights in patterns not found on official charts. Some speculate these are natural illusions caused by weather, refraction, or fatigue. Others see them as evidence of temporal distortions, glimpses of the past, or the future, imprinted on specific landscapes. For Goddard, the experience remained one of the most vivid of his life. He never claimed to understand it fully, only that it had happened, and that time, for a moment, had revealed itself in layers. Today, Edinburgh Airport stands on the grounds of the old Turnhouse site, its runways paved and busy with modern aircraft. And yet, in the story of Sir Victor Goddard, the airfield carries a hidden history. A place where a pilot once saw not what was, but what would be, and it leaves one final question in the silence above the runways. Was Goddard's flight an isolated slip? May 2003, Luanda, Angola. A Boeing 727 rolled down the runway without clearance, lifted into the air, and vanished from radar. The plane was never found. Investigators searched thousands of miles of African wilderness. The aircraft and its crew were gone. The Boeing 727 was not a small plane. It was nearly 60 meters long, with 3 powerful engines mounted at the tail, designed to carry over 150 passengers across continents. The aircraft in question had once served with American Airlines before being sold into private use. By 2003, it was parked at Quattro de Fevereiro Airport in Luanda, awaiting refurbishment. For months, the plane sat idle, watched by ground crews, its future uncertain. On May 25, shortly before sunset, something unusual occurred. Without authorization, the 727 began to taxi. Witnesses described the lumbering jet moving down the runway, its engines roaring to life. No flight plan had been filed, no clearance requested. Controllers attempted to make contact, but their calls went unanswered. The aircraft surged forward, gathered speed, and lifted into the sky, climbing westward over the Atlantic. 2 men were believed to be aboard: an American mechanic named Ben Padilla and a local assistant. Neither was a licensed airline pilot, but both had experience with smaller aircraft. Their families insisted they had no reason to steal the jet. No demands were made, no communications sent. Yet within minutes, the 727 disappeared from radar screens. Authorities scrambled. Angolan officials requested international assistance. The United States dispatched intelligence resources, including satellites and reconnaissance flights, to track the rogue aircraft. But no trace emerged. It had vanished into one of the most heavily monitored airspaces on Earth. The possibilities were troubling. A Boeing 727 carries nearly 14 0 gallons of fuel at full capacity. If commandeered, it could have been converted into a weapon. In the post-9/11 climate, the disappearance sparked alarm across governments and aviation agencies. For weeks, rumours circulated of sightings. A jet landing on a remote strip in the Democratic Republic of Congo, another overflying Nigeria at dusk. None were confirmed. The search widened. Teams scoured maps of Africa, marking every airstrip long enough to handle a 727. Some were abandoned military bases, others remote mining outposts hidden in jungle or desert. Investigators followed leads into Angola's hinterland, across Congo's dense forests, and deep into the Sahara. Yet not a single scrap of wreckage, not a single verified landing was found. The mystery deepened as the years passed. Aviation experts debated the odds. Flying such a large jet without proper system support would be extraordinarily difficult. Without regular maintenance, the engines could fail. Without transponder codes, avoiding detection would be nearly impossible. And yet, the aircraft remained missing. Speculation filled the void. Some believed the jet had been stolen for parts, stripped in a remote hangar, and sold piece by piece into the shadow economy of aviation. Others suggested it had crashed into the Atlantic that very night, sinking into deep waters where no sonar had searched. The most unsettling theories pointed to intentional disappearance, that the aircraft had been taken for use in smuggling, or worse, to be weaponized in future attacks. But no confirmed wreckage has ever surfaced, no distress calls, no fuel slicks, no sightings of debris along Africa's coasts. It was as if the 727 had been erased. For Ben Padilla's family, the disappearance remains a wound without closure. To this day, they have no answers, only the knowledge that he boarded a silent aircraft one evening in Angola and never returned. And for investigators, the case is a reminder of the fragility of certainty in aviation. Even in the 21st century, with satellites overhead and radar arrays sweeping the skies, an aircraft weighing nearly 100 pounds can still slip into silence. The vanishing 727 remains unsolved. Somewhere, in ocean depths or on forgotten runways, its final chapter waits. But until it is found, its story stands as one of the strangest disappearances in modern aviation. January 30th, 1948. The Avro Tudor 4-star Tiger vanished en route to Bermuda. No distress call was heard. Its last report placed it less than an hour from land. The weather was calm. Nothing remained. The Star Tiger belonged to the British South American Airways fleet, a sleek 4-engine airliner designed to carry passengers across the Atlantic. On that winter morning, it lifted from the Azores, bound for Bermuda with 25 souls on board 6 crew and 19 passengers. Among them were businessmen, holidaymakers, and a former member of the British Parliament. Captain B.W. Macmillan, an experienced wartime pilot, commanded the aircraft. He was cautious, known for his steady judgment and attention to detail. His co-pilot, David Tanner, was equally seasoned. The Avro Tudor was not without flaws, but Macmillan had flown it often. He trusted its limits. The flight began smoothly. Weather forecasts predicted calm skies along the route. The plan was to cruise at 20 feet, then gradually descend toward Bermuda in the early hours of January 30th. Throughout the night, routine radio reports came through, nothing unusual, no sign of difficulty. At 3:15 a.m., the Star Tiger sent its final transmission, a position report placing it less than an hour from Bermuda. Macmillan noted they were descending to 20 feet, a common practice for night approaches in that region. The tone of the message was steady, unhurried. No sign of distress. Then, silence. When the Star Tiger failed to arrive, search operations began at dawn. Dozens of aircraft and ships scoured the sea between the Azores and Bermuda. The ocean was calm, visibility clear. If the Tudor had ditched, debris should have been visible. Life rafts, bodies, or even fragments of the airframe should have floated. Yet the waters were empty. Days stretched into weeks. No wreckage was ever recovered. The aircraft and everyone aboard had simply disappeared. Investigators faced a puzzle. Mechanical failure was possible, but unlikely to silence the crew without warning. Pilots in distress almost always broadcast maydays, even in their final moments. Weather reports confirmed calm skies, no storms, no turbulence capable of tearing an aircraft apart. In their final report, officials wrote, "It may truly be said that no more baffling problem has ever been presented to investigators. There's not the storing in not flee. Theories emerged in abundance. Some suggested fuel exhaustion, though records indicated reserves sufficient to reach Bermuda with margin to spare. Others pointed to mechanical weaknesses in the Tudor fleet, but no evidence supported this particular failure." The Star Tiger had vanished within the region later dubbed the Bermuda Triangle, a stretch of ocean already whispered about in connection with strange disappearances. The Star Tiger was not the only one. In January 1949, a nearly identical aircraft, the Star Ariel, vanished on the same route, also without a distress call. The parallels deepened the mystery. 2 airliners, 2 crews, 2 sets of passengers, gone in eerily similar circumstances within a year. For families, the lack of closure was devastating. Without wreckage, no answers could be offered. Children grew into adults, never knowing what happened to their parents. Spouses waited in vain for news that never came. Today, modern sonar has mapped the Atlantic in extraordinary detail, but no trace of the Star Tiger has surfaced. Some researchers suggest the wreck lies hidden in deep trenches, far beyond reach of conventional search. Others believe it may have broken apart mid-air, scattering debris so widely that none was ever recovered. And then there are those who consider another possibility: that the Star Tiger slipped, however briefly, into a place outside our understanding. A corridor of silence where time and distance do not behave as expected. What is known is only this: an experienced crew, a calm night, and an aircraft less than an hour from safety. And then, nothing. The Atlantic remains vast, its secrets folded beneath waves and time. Or perhaps, like so many others before it, the plane's journey continues, unseen, along a path that was never meant to exist. Pilots approaching Arizona in 1997 reported immense formations of light moving silently across the horizon. Yet entire crews described the same formation, shifting like aircraft on an invisible route. It was the evening of March 13th, 1997. Across the southwestern United States, thousands of residents looked skyward as something unusual passed silently overhead. Some saw a single triangular craft stretching wider than city blocks. Others reported a vast procession of lights, glowing amber, holding formation without sound. Among them were trained observers, commercial airline pilots, private aviators, and crews accustomed to distinguishing aircraft from atmospheric illusions. One crew, approaching Phoenix from the east, described the lights as immense, like a fleet moving in formation. They expected to see radar returns, confirming traffic, yet their instruments were clear. Air traffic control, monitoring the same sector, registered nothing. The skies were officially empty, and still, the lights remained. Ground witnesses were no less struck. Residents across Nevada, Arizona, and Sonora, Mexico, described the lights with remarkable consistency. They moved slowly, deliberately, like aircraft holding a steady heading. Some claimed they could see structure between the lights, a dark mass blotting out stars. Others insisted the lights floated independently, gliding like orbs across the night sky. Military officials offered explanations. The US Air Force stated that flares had been dropped during training exercises south of Phoenix. Under the right conditions, flares can appear suspended, glowing against mountain backdrops. Yet the earliest reports began nearly 2 hours before the flare drops. Pilots too dismissed the explanation. Flares do not travel in tight, shifting formations for miles across controlled airspace. The Federal Aviation Administration maintained there was no unusual traffic that night. But pilots logged their accounts anyway, noting the precision of the lights, their steady course, and their silence. What troubled investigators most was the scale. The formation spanned miles, visible simultaneously across entire counties. Even conservative estimates placed the distance between lights as greater than conventional aircraft would maintain. And yet the pattern held, moving as one, until it dissolved into the desert darkness. Skeptics argue that the event was a convergence of misidentifications, planes, flares, and stars seen under unusual atmospheric conditions, but the sheer number of reports, ranging from casual observers to seasoned aviators, resists easy dismissal. The Phoenix Lights remain one of the most widely witnessed aerial anomalies in modern history. For those in the cockpit that night, the experience was unforgettable. One pilot later recounted, "We see aircraft every day. These weren't aircraft. They moved as if on a route, but a route we couldn't chart, on instruments we couldn't trace. The felt and the lest of force of Reeses, with Frengleave Ray on the Fours." The phenomenon has since been studied as part of a broader pattern of unexplained lights in aviation. Similar formations have been reported in Alaska, over the Pacific, and along the coasts of South America. Always the same details: silence, scale, and the absence of radar confirmation. Theories extend beyond the earthly. Some propose atmospheric lensing effects, rare refractions that bend light across vast distances, creating illusions of formation. Others whisper of unknown technologies moving along paths invisible to conventional tracking. And a few suggest corridors of sky where time and perception fold, allowing glimpses of routes we were never meant to see. The Phoenix Lights remain unsolved. No official body has closed the case with certainty. For those who watched from the ground, and for those in the air that night, the memory is sharp, luminous, and unsettling, because what they saw was not random. It was ordered, deliberate, and immense, as if an invisible flight path had opened briefly over Arizona, carrying passengers we do not yet understand. In 1986, Japan Airlines Flight 1628 reported following a giant craft for nearly an hour over Alaska. The crew described its size as larger than an aircraft carrier. Radar confirmed an anomaly. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. It was November 17th, a cold, clear evening above the North Pacific. Japan Airlines Flight 1628, a Boeing 747 cargo freighter, was en route from Paris to Tokyo, carrying a shipment of wine. At the controls was Captain Kenju Terauchi, a veteran with over 10 zero-hours of flying experience. With him were his first officer and flight engineer, both seasoned professionals. At approximately 5:11 p.m., as the aircraft crossed central Alaska at 35,000 feet, Terauchi noticed unusual lights in the distance. At first, he assumed they were military aircraft, perhaps tankers conducting exercises, but as the lights drew nearer, their movement became erratic. They darted, shifted, and repositioned at speeds no conventional plane could match. Within minutes, the lights had taken position alongside the 747. Two smaller objects appeared first, glowing brightly, pacing the cargo jet's wings. Then, beyond them, a vast silhouette emerged. Terauchi would later describe it as a giant disc-shaped craft, so large it dwarfed the jumbo jet. It was larger than an aircraft carrier, he told investigators. The encounter lasted nearly 50 minutes. Throughout that time, the crew communicated with Anchorage Air Traffic Control. Controllers confirmed radar contact with an unidentified object trailing Flight 1628. The US Air Force also logged an anomaly on its long-range systems. Yet when military aircraft were dispatched to intercept, the craft vanished. For Terauchi and his crew, the experience was vivid and terrifying. At one point, the lights grew so intense that the cockpit was flooded with brilliance, casting sharp shadows across the instrument panel. The crew attempted evasive maneuvers, banking the heavy 747 to the left and then to the right. The objects followed smoothly, unshaken by turbulence or sudden changes in direction. Then, as suddenly as it began, the encounter ended. The lights faded into the night, the radar blip dissolved, and Flight 1628 continued on to Anchorage without further incident. When the crew filed their report, the case drew global attention. The Federal Aviation Administration conducted an investigation, compiling transcripts, radar logs, and crew testimonies. Officials confirmed that an unidentified target had appeared on both civilian and military radar. They also confirmed that the crew of Flight 1628 628 were consistent and credible in their accounts. Yet the official conclusion remained ambiguous. The FAA classified the incident as unidentified, without offering an explanation. The US Air Force quietly closed its inquiry. Captain Terauchi was reassigned to a desk position soon after, his credibility subtly undermined by those wary of the publicity his claims had generated. For aviation historians, the case stands out not because of speculation, but because of its documentation. Here was a commercial flight, flown by seasoned professionals, corroborated by radar, reporting a craft of extraordinary size. No weather phenomena explained it, no military operation matched the details, and no conventional aircraft moved with such agility. Over time, theories have ranged from experimental technology to atmospheric anomalies. Some suggest Terauchi and his crew glimpsed a rare mirage effect, refracted lights from ground installations bent upward by cold layers of air. But that does not explain the radar returns. Others whisper of technologies hidden from the public, operating in skies we assume we control. Yet perhaps the most unsettling possibility is the simplest. That Flight 1628 briefly shared its route with something outside our understanding, something travelling along a flight path not charted on any map. The crew never forgot what they saw. And as the years passed, the transcripts remained in official archives, a reminder that not all mysteries dissolve with time. Above Alaska's frozen expanse, for nearly an hour, an invisible corridor opened, and a plane full of wine, bound for Tokyo, became witness to the impossible. In the 1960s, a DC-7 departed Lisbon bound for Havana. The flight landed safely, but its arrival time puzzled controllers. By their calculations, the aircraft had crossed the Atlantic hours faster than its engines could have achieved. The Douglas DC-7 was one of the most advanced piston-engine airliners of its era, a long-range workhorse capable of flying transatlantic routes before the jet age fully took hold. Its cruising speed averaged around 350 miles per hour, and a journey from Europe to Cuba typically took over 13 hours, depending on weather and headwinds. The flight in question, logged, filed and recorded by multiple agencies, had been expected to arrive in Havana well after midnight. Instead, radar picked it up approaching Cuban airspace almost 3 hours ahead of schedule. Controllers at José Martí International were baffled. The DC-7 had not refueled mid-air, nor had it reported tailwinds strong enough to account for the gain. Its crew filed no unusual reports during the crossing. To them, the flight had felt utterly ordinary. When the plane landed, ground staff noted nothing amiss. Passengers disembarked calmly, unaware they had arrived significantly earlier than expected. The flight crew, when questioned, insisted their instruments had behaved normally. Fuel burn matched the distance travelled. Engine performance was steady. Their clocks and logbooks reflected only the scheduled flight time, and yet the aircraft was on the ground in Havana hours before any calculation allowed. Investigators checked weather charts. Atlantic winds had been mild that evening, offering no jet stream powerful enough to accelerate a prop-driven aircraft to such speeds. The DC-7 had not flown unusually high, nor taken a shortcut outside normal routes. Navigation records placed it firmly on course, crossing standard checkpoints exactly where it should have. Everything about the flight was consistent except the elapsed time. Some suggested clerical error, that departure or arrival times had been misfiled, but the logs were cross-verified. Lisbon controllers confirmed takeoff time. Havana controllers confirmed touchdown. Both matched independent observations from radar stations and ships along the Atlantic corridor. In technical terms, the DC-7 appeared to have travelled faster than its maximum possible airspeed, as though it had been carried by a tailwind that did not exist, or had crossed through a stretch of sky where distance itself had contracted. Aviation folklore has long whispered of such anomalies. Flights that arrive ahead of schedule without explanation, journeys where crews report the sensation of missing time, or navigational instruments that briefly show impossible readings. In some cases, pilots describe corridors of unusually calm air, like invisible highways where resistance drops away and ground speeds soar beyond their aircraft's design. Scientists propose rare atmospheric conditions might be responsible, jet stream funnels forming at altitudes lower than expected, or gravity waves rippling through the upper atmosphere, subtly altering perception of time and distance. But in this case, no such conditions were observed. For passengers, the event passed unnoticed. For controllers and investigators, it lingered. The official reports, filed quietly, offered no conclusion. The DC-7 had flown safely, on time by its own clocks and impossibly early by everyone else's. In later years, researchers comparing cases of time-gain flights pointed to this journey as one of the most convincing. The data was consistent, the witnesses professional, and the anomaly undeniable. Something in the Atlantic corridor had allowed a piston-powered aircraft to complete a crossing as though it had been a jet. No one could explain it then. No one has since, and perhaps that is why the case endures. A flight without distress, without disappearance, yet with a mystery just as profound. Because if time can contract silently, unnoticed by those on board, how many other journeys have crossed the ocean in ways that should not be possible, and how many still will? In 1977, Concorde test flights recorded radar traces vanishing mid-air. The supersonic jet continued smoothly, yet ground stations lost its signal entirely for minutes at a time. The passengers never noticed. The Concorde was the pride of Anglo-French aviation, a machine that promised to shrink the world by cutting travel time in half. With 4 Rolls-Royce Snecma Olympus 593 turbojets, it cruised at Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, and carried its passengers higher than any other commercial jet at altitudes above 60 feet. By the late 1970s, as the aircraft moved from prototype to operational service, test flights were closely monitored by both civil and military radar stations. Every moment in the sky was logged, every parameter analysed, and it was during these test runs that anomalies appeared. Controllers in southern England first noted it. One moment, Concorde's blip showed steady on radar, climbing smoothly. The next, it was gone. Entirely. No fade, no weak signal. A complete disappearance. Minutes later, just as abruptly, the trace reappeared in the same trajectory, as if nothing had interrupted its course. At first, engineers suspected equipment failure. Radar screens of the 1970s could glitch under heavy workloads, but subsequent tests produced the same result not once, but multiple times. Civilian and military stations independently confirmed the disappearances. Each time, the aircraft remained visible to other radar arrays further afield, while local tracking lost it altogether. The pilots, meanwhile, reported nothing unusual. Inside the cockpit, instruments were steady. Airspeed, altitude, fuel consumption, all normal. Passengers sipping champagne in the cabin felt no jolt, no turbulence, nothing to suggest their aircraft had temporarily vanished from the ground's perspective. Investigators looked for patterns. They found none. The disappearances occurred in clear weather and cloudy skies alike. They occurred at subsonic and supersonic speeds. They occurred when Concorde was climbing, cruising, and descending. Always the same. A sudden blank screen, followed minutes later by reappearance. One theory suggested the supersonic jet's sleek design and high-altitude operation created radar cross-section anomalies. The Concorde's fuselage, with its long pointed nose and thin delta wings, reflected radar differently depending on angle and atmospheric conditions. Perhaps, some argued, under certain circumstances, the aircraft's signals scattered so widely that ground radar lost its return, but this explanation faltered under scrutiny. Concorde's radar signature was strong, larger than many military aircraft that never produced such disappearances. And the loss wasn't partial. It wasn't a weakening or distortion. It was total absence, as if the plane had ceased to exist. A more unsettling possibility emerged, that Concorde, travelling at the edge of known performance, brushed against conditions where time and space blurred. At 60 feet, the curvature of the Earth was visible, and the atmosphere thinned into the darkness of space. Pilots often described the experience as otherworldly, with the sky above turning indigo and the horizon curving beneath them. Could there have been atmospheric or electromagnetic effects at those altitudes, capable of bending radar waves or bending something else entirely? Whispers spread among engineers and ground staff. Some called it a time pocket, a corridor where the aircraft briefly slipped from measurable reality. Others thought of it more simply as a technological blind spot, a reminder that even the most advanced machines sometimes travel into domains our instruments cannot fully follow. The disappearances were quietly filed away. Publicly, Concorde was celebrated for its speed, its elegance, its ability to fly passengers from London to New York in under 4 hours. Few outside aviation circles ever heard of the blips that weren't there. Yet for those who watched radar screens in 1977, the memory persists. A supersonic jet, real and visible to the human eye, vanished from the instruments designed to measure it. For the passengers, it was nothing more than another smooth flight. For those on the ground, it was a reminder that even in an age of precision, flight paths sometimes slip into the impossible. Though no plane flew over Siberia in 1908, eyewitnesses described a fireball that shifted course mid-flight before detonating above the forest. Some suggested meteors. Others whispered of paths that don't obey gravity. The morning of June 30th, 1908 began quietly in the Siberian wilderness. Herdsmen, trappers, and nomadic Evenki hunters tended to their camps as the sun rose over the endless taiga. Then, at 7:14 a.m., the stillness broke. A brilliant object blazed across the sky, so bright it was seen hundreds of miles away. Witnesses described it as a glowing sphere, white at its core with a trailing tail of fire. Dogs howled, earth trembled, and people shielded their eyes from the radiance. But what startled them most was not just the fireball, but its behavior. Eyewitness accounts insisted the object changed direction mid-flight. Some claimed it zigzagged, others that it slowed as if resisting gravity. It was no simple meteor, plunging unbroken to Earth. It moved with the strangeness of intention. Moments later, a blinding flash tore across the land. A shockwave followed, flattening 150 square kilometers of forest, more than 80 million trees in a radial pattern. The ground shook like an earthquake. Windows shattered 300 miles away. Yet when expeditions finally reached the site years later, they found no impact crater. The devastation was real, but the cause seemed to have detonated in mid-air. Scientists called it the Tunguska event, attributing the blast to an airburst, the explosion of a stony asteroid or icy comet fragment breaking apart before reaching the ground. Estimates placed its energy at 10 to 15 megatons, equal to a large thermonuclear device. And yet, the anomalies persisted. If it was a comet, where were the chemical traces of ice and dust? If it was a meteor, why no fragments of iron or rock scattered across the blast zone? Investigators combed the area for years, turning up only tiny glassy spherules embedded in soil too few to explain an object so large. And still, the testimonies remained. Dozens of villagers and hunters reported the fireball altering course. Some swore they saw it pause, hovering briefly before resuming its path. Others described a vertical column of light rising into the sky moments after the explosion, as if the object had departed rather than been destroyed. Decades later, new theories emerged. Perhaps the fireball was not a natural body, but a fragment of antimatter colliding with Earth's atmosphere, annihilating on contact. Some physicists speculated about miniature black holes passing invisibly, their immense energy release causing the devastation. Still others leaned toward more speculative frontiers, that Tunguska was not a meteor at all, but a craft, following a trajectory that obeyed rules outside conventional physics. For aviation historians, the link lies in the sky path itself. The flight of the Tunguska fireball resembled no ordinary descent. Its course mirrored the testimony of later pilots who reported sudden bends, turns, or disappearances of objects moving impossibly fast across controlled airspace. Was the 1908 anomaly the first recorded instance of a path that exists outside our known corridors of flight, an invisible route cutting across gravity itself? Even today, satellite scans of the Tunguska region reveal the scar of flattened trees radiating outward like the petals of a flower. In the very center, oddly, some trees still stand stripped of branches, but upright, as if shielded by a column of force descending vertically. Over a century has passed, and the forest has grown back. Yet the mystery of that morning endures, a blast that shook the earth, a fireball that seemed to steer, and a sky path that resisted the pull of gravity. Whether meteor, comet, or something stranger, the Tunguska anomaly remains a reminder that not all routes through the air are charted, and not all journeys obey the rules of the world we know. 916, villagers in Norfolk described a massive airship drifting silently above. Yet German records listed no flights that night. British radar stations, newly established, saw nothing. At the height of the First World War, Britain lived under the constant shadow of Zeppelin raids. The giant German airships, some over 600 feet long, could carry bombs across the Channel and hover above London in the dead of night. Their droning engines and looming silhouettes were symbols of fear and fascination alike. So, when residents of Norfolk reported seeing one such craft on a clear spring night in 1916, no one dismissed the accounts outright. Witnesses described a vast, cigar-shaped silhouette gliding low across the countryside. Others insisted it made no sound at all, no steady drone of Maybach engines, no hum of propellers. Just silence. The strangeness deepened when military records were consulted. That night, no German Zeppelin had crossed into British airspace. Weather logs confirmed clear skies, conditions favourable for raids. Yet all German airship operations were grounded due to mechanical issues and poor conditions on the continent. The Norfolk sighting could not be explained by enemy activity. British authorities investigated. By 1916, Britain's rudimentary radar and early warning systems were still in their infancy, but they were functional enough to track large targets crossing the Channel. That night, no such blip appeared. Yet villagers across several towns described the same thing: a looming, drifting airship, low enough that its shape was clear against the stars. Some believed the reports were fueled by fear. Wartime nerves, they said, could turn clouds into zeppelins and shadows into threats. But many witnesses were seasoned farmers and soldiers, familiar with the distinct profile of a zeppelin. Their descriptions were consistent. A massive craft moving deliberately across the night sky. One farmer swore he could make out its markings, though he could not identify them. Another claimed the object seemed to vanish into thin air after passing behind a stand of trees, leaving the night sky empty. No explosions followed, no bombs were dropped, and no reports of damage were filed anywhere in the county. Theories quickly multiplied. Some suggested it had been a secret British airship, perhaps a prototype undergoing tests far from public knowledge. Yet no records from the Royal Naval Air Service matched the time or location. Others proposed atmospheric illusions, light from stars or planets refracted in such a way as to mimic the shape of a rigid airship. But could refraction explain the scale, the detail, and the silence described by so many? In the years after the war, the Phantom Zeppelin of Norfolk became part of local folklore. Stories spread of other phantom airships seen across Britain during those years, mysterious craft that appeared and vanished without warning, often with no record of any real Zeppelin activity nearby. Some historians argue these sightings represent an early form of phantom aircraft phenomenon, precursors to the UFO accounts that would emerge decades later. What unsettled investigators most was the silence. Genuine Zeppelins were anything but quiet. Their engines could be heard long before the ship was visible. The Norfolk craft, by contrast, seemed to glide without sound, as if insulated from the world around it. Today, the event remains an enigma. Wartime records confirm no German activity. British files confirm no domestic operations. The skies that night should have been empty, and yet dozens of witnesses swore otherwise. The Phantom Zeppelin drifts still through history, a ghost of the skies that left no wreckage, no records, only testimony. Whether illusion, secret technology, or something stranger, it reminds us that even in times of war, not all threats come from known paths. Some flight paths, it seems, belong to craft we cannot trace, airships that glide in silence, never landing, never recorded, never explained. March 1962. Flying Tiger Flight 739, carrying 93 soldiers, vanished over the Pacific. No distress calls, no debris. Witnesses from a ship below described a bright flash in the sky. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1049. Super Constellation, one of the most distinctive passenger planes of its era, with triple tails and four-piston engines that carried both civilians and military personnel across continents. That night, it had departed Guam en route to the Philippines, a as part of a long trans-Pacific journey moving American troops to Vietnam. On board were 93 US Army soldiers, 3 South Vietnamese, and a crew of 11. Captain Gregory P. Thomas was at the controls. He was experienced, with more than 19 flying hours logged. Weather conditions were favourable, calm skies, good visibility, no storms on the projected route. At 5:45 p.m. local time, the Constellation departed Guam. Its expected arrival in the Philippines was just after midnight. The flight checked in normally, reporting its altitude and progress. Then, at 8:22 p.m., radio silence. Controllers attempted repeated contact. No response came back. By dawn, the aircraft was officially declared missing. What followed was one of the largest air searches in Pacific history. The operation lasted 8 days. Not a single piece of debris, no oil slick, no raft, no body was ever recovered. For the families of the 107 aboard, silence was the only answer. And yet, there was one piece of testimony that would not fade. A Liberian tanker ship, the SSTL Lenzen, reported witnessing a sudden bright flash in the night sky directly in the flight's path. Crew members described the light as intense, lasting for several seconds before fading into darkness. Their account was logged and forwarded to investigators. The US Civil Aeronautics Board concluded the investigation with no definitive cause. The final report stated, "The board is unable to determine the probable cause of the disappearance of Flight 739. It remains one of the only major military charter flights in history to vanish without leaving a trace." Speculation quickly filled the void. Some suggested a catastrophic mid-air explosion, perhaps sabotage, given the sensitive military nature of the mission. Others argued structural failure, though the Constellation was a proven design with a strong record of service. No distress call argued against mechanical failure. Experienced crews almost always transmitted a mayday, even in their final seconds. The Cold War context fueled darker theories. Was the aircraft intercepted by hostile forces? Was it carrying cargo beyond official records? Could it have been caught in classified operations, its disappearance later obscured by official silence? None of these suggestions were ever proven, but they lingered, whispered among the families of the lost. Decades later, modern sonar mapping of Pacific seafloors has failed to identify any trace of Flight 739. Unlike shallow water crashes, which eventually yield wreckage, the deep Pacific remains largely unsearched, its trenches capable of swallowing entire aircraft without a trace. But for those who stood on the deck of the Lenzen that night, the flash remains unforgettable. No benefit from speaking out. To them, the aircraft ended in fire, though no evidence was ever found to confirm it. Today, a memorial stands in Columbia Falls, Maine, honoring the 107 souls aboard. Their names are etched in granite, facing the Atlantic, thousands of miles from the ocean that still holds their story. Flight 739 remains one of aviation's great mysteries. A military charter that vanished in clear skies, leaving only silence, a ship's testimony, and the unanswered question of what truly happened above the Pacific that night. In the South Pacific, pilots have logged sightings of airstrips, complete with towers and runways that later flights failed to locate. The South Pacific is vast, dotted with islands separated by hundreds of miles of open sea. During World War II, the region bristled with makeshift runways, hastily built on coral atolls and jungle clearings. Many were temporary, abandoned once campaigns moved on. Decades later, some of these strips remain marked on aviation charts as warnings or points of reference, but others exist only in stories, reports from pilots who swore they saw runways where no island should have been. One such account came from a commercial pilot in the 1960s, ferrying supplies between Fiji and Tahiti. Midway across his route, he reported seeing a lit airfield below. A clearly defined strip, floodlights along its length, a control tower standing tall against the night sky. Low on fuel, he considered diverting, but weather cleared ahead, and he pressed on. When he later cross-checked his charts, the location was nothing but open ocean. On his return flight days later, the spot was empty. No runway, no island, no lights. Other testimonies followed. A Royal New Zealand Air Force crew in the 1970s logged a nearly identical sighting. a perfectly rectangular strip with taxiways branching from its edges. The co-pilot even noted radio chatter faintly heard on his headset, as though a tower had tried to reach them on standard frequencies. Yet when they circled back minutes later, the field was gone. These accounts were catalogued by aviation authorities. Though quietly, the official explanations pointed to optical illusions, moonlight reflecting on waves, producing straight lines that resembled runways. Others suggested mirages, the same phenomena that cause distant ships to appear suspended in mid-air over hot seas. In the vastness of the Pacific, illusions can linger for miles, bending light in uncanny ways, but skeptics of the mirage theory note the precision of these descriptions. Pilots spoke of taxiways, painted numbers, and visible towers. Some even described seeing service vehicles moving along the strip. Such details go far beyond atmospheric distortion. Then there is the matter of the radio. Several crews reported hearing faint but structured signals clip transmissions on aviation bands, never long enough to record, never clear enough to identify. The voices, they said, were calm, procedural, like those of trained controllers, yet no nearby facility admitted to transmitting, and no islands with towers existed in the reported coordinates. Folklore within the aviation community whispers of phantom fields, airstrips that exist out of phase with the present, glimpses of either past installations or future ones. Some speculate that these are echoes of wartime runways that once dotted the Pacific, their presence somehow imprinted into the atmosphere, reappearing decades after they were abandoned and reclaimed by the sea. Others lean toward more speculative explanations. Time slips, corridors where aircraft briefly tune into layers of reality not charted on any map. Stories persist of pilots who, running dangerously low on fuel, attempted to land on these phantom strips. In one version, a small cargo plane descended toward a brightly lit runway, only to find solid ocean reflecting back in the final seconds, forcing a desperate climb. The co-pilot, shaken, swore he had seen men in uniform standing at the edge of the field before it dissolved. To this day, maps of the Pacific hold blank spaces, stretches of water where no island rises, no tower stands, and yet where pilots claim to have seen infrastructure too precise to dismiss as imagination. The vanished island airfield remains one of the strangest categories of aerial mystery. Not a disappearance, but an appearance, a runway waiting in the middle of nowhere, a place to land that cannot be found again. For the crews who saw them, the memory is unshakable. Lights shining on the sea, geometry drawn on water, and the unsettling realization that the sky sometimes reveals destinations not meant for this world. Norway, 1980s. Pilots reported luminous spheres pacing their aircraft as they descended through Hessdalen Valley. Locals confirmed the sightings. Instruments read no traffic. The valley of Hessdalen, nestled between mountain ridges in central Norway, is a quiet place. A narrow river winds through scattered farms, and winter brings long nights under pale auroras. Yet beginning in the early 1980s, this remote valley became known for something stranger than northern lights. Glowing orbs of light, sometimes hovering above the ground, sometimes weaving silently through the sky, and, on occasion, pacing aircraft descending into nearby airfields. For local residents, the phenomenon became almost routine. Bright lights appeared in the night sky, often described as yellow-white spheres the size of small cars. They could hang motionless for minutes, then accelerate with startling speed. Others darted silently between peaks, as though following invisible paths. Pilots, too, began to report encounters. Several flights approaching Trondheim Airport logged unusual lights maneuvering near their wings. Crews described luminous spheres matching their descent, shifting position as if under control, but producing no radar returns. Controllers confirmed there was no other traffic in the sector. For those in the cockpit, the sensation was unnerving. The visible company in the sky, yet absent from every instrument designed to measure it. The lights were not isolated incidents. Between 1981 and 1984 alone, more than 800 documented sightings were recorded, some lasting hours. Amateur photographers captured glowing trails, and video footage showed orbs moving with steady, deliberate motion. Scientists from the University of Oslo and the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment established observation stations in the valley, equipping them with cameras, radar, and magnetometers. Their data confirmed the phenomena. On several occasions, radar tracked slow-moving targets where lights were visible, but moments later, the radar blips vanished while the lights remained. At other times, cameras captured orbs that left no radar signature at all. Instruments measuring the electromagnetic field in the valley recorded anomalies during active sightings, as though the lights carried their own invisible charge. Explanations have ranged widely. Some propose that the lights are plasma formations, created when ionized gas trapped in the valley's unusual geology discharges energy. Hessdalen sits on metallic mineral deposits that might act as a natural battery, fueling glowing discharges. Others argue the lights are ball lightning, a rare, poorly understood phenomenon where energy spheres form during electrical storms. Yet many Hessdalen sightings occurred under clear skies, without storms or lightning to explain them. Theories extend further. Some scientists suggest the valley's shape funnels atmospheric conditions into unique patterns, amplifying natural light phenomena. Others whisper of artificial origins. Lights moving too deliberately, too intelligently to be explained as random plasma. For the locals, the lights are not theory but memory. Farmers tell of orbs hovering silently outside bedroom windows, illuminating entire rooms. Hikers describe being followed along mountain trails by glowing spheres that vanish when approached. And pilots, trained to separate illusion from fact, remain unsettled by lights that match their course with precision no natural phenomenon should display. Despite decades of study, the Hessdalen lights remain unsolved. They are catalogued, measured, photographed, and yet still unexplained. Instruments confirm their existence, but no single theory accounts for all observations. The valley today is quieter than in the 1980s, though reports continue intermittently. Scientific monitoring stations remain, their cameras still watching the sky. At night, locals still glance upward when a glow appears between the ridges. For aviation, the Hessdalen lights are a reminder that not all skies are mapped. Pilots navigating the valley describe a sensation difficult to record, the feeling of being watched, accompanied by companions of light whose paths do not appear on radar. Instruments may insist the skies are empty, but the lights, silent and steady, suggest otherwise. A test pilot in the Mojave Desert logged entering a sudden storm cloud, though the skies around were clear. On exiting, his clock showed a 30-minute discrepancy. The Mojave has long been the proving ground of experimental aviation. Its endless skies, sparse population, and wide stretches of desert provide the perfect stage for testing aircraft at the limits of performance. By the 1950s, Edwards Air Force Base and surrounding fields were alive with jet prototypes, rocket planes, and supersonic experiments that would shape the future of flight. The pilot, an Air Force officer whose logbooks remain in archives, was testing a modified fighter aircraft during a routine endurance flight. Conditions were perfect: clear skies, calm air, visibility stretching for miles. At 15,000 feet, he maintained a steady heading, noting landmarks of the desert floor below. Then, directly in front of him, a storm appeared where none should have been. It wasn't vast, but compact and sharply defined, a dense grey cloud suspended against the blue. No storm system had been forecast. Weather charts from that day confirmed stable, dry air, yet the cloud hung there, motionless, in an otherwise empty sky. Following protocol, he entered the formation to test instrumentation under adverse conditions. Inside, visibility dropped to 0. Lightning-like flashes flickered, though no thunder followed. The cockpit filled with an odd glow, casting shadows across his dials. What struck him most was the silence. Even the steady roar of the engine seemed muffled, as if wrapped in layers of insulation. He described it later as flying in cotton, but heavier, as if air itself had thickened. Minutes later, he broke through. Sunlight returned. The desert stretched beneath him, unchanged. But when he checked his watch, something was wrong. The mission clock read 30 minutes later than his wristwatch, though both had been synchronized before the flight. Fuel consumption, too, suggested the aircraft had spent more time in the air than he experienced. Confused, he radioed ground control. Their records matched the cockpit chronometer, not his own watch. By their accounts, he had been inside the cloud for over half an hour. To him, It had lasted only minutes. The discrepancy was logged, quietly, without official explanation. Meteorologists confirmed no weather systems over the Mojave that day. No storms, no anomalies on radar. Pilots flying in adjacent sectors reported only clear skies. The incident was not unique. Other test pilots have spoken, cautiously, of strange clouds over desert ranges, compact, luminous, and uncharted. Some described compasses spinning as they passed through. Others recalled radios cutting out, only to return with their clocks subtly shifted. These accounts, often buried in technical appendices, hint at atmospheric events science cannot yet categorize. Some physicists suggest localized electromagnetic anomalies, perhaps linked to underground mineral deposits common in the Mojave. Energy discharged into the atmosphere could ionize pockets of air, forming clouds unlike normal weather systems. Such conditions might interfere with avionics, even atomic clocks. Others whisper of time-slips corridors where space and time distort. The pilot himself, in later interviews, admitted the thought unsettled him. He had entered a cloud where none existed, flown for minutes, and emerged half an hour later into skies as clear as before. For aviation, the case remains officially unexplained. The logbooks still note the discrepancy, preserved as data without interpretation. For the pilot, it was a memory that resisted dismissal. He had flown through countless storms in his career, but this was different. A storm with no forecast, no thunder, no rain, a storm that seemed less like weather and more like a doorway. And in the endless desert sky, the question lingers. How many such clouds hang, waiting silent, compact, and invisible until the moment a plane enters and time itself shifts? Airlines 513. A Brazilian case. An aircraft identified as Santiago Airlines Flight 513 reportedly landed decades after disappearing. Its passengers were skeletal. The airline had long ceased to exist. The story begins in 1954. Santiago Airlines, a small regional carrier based in South America, filed a routine flight plan for a Lockheed Super Constellation, traveling from Aachen, West Germany, to Porto Alegre, Brazil. The four-engine airliner lifted smoothly from the runway, its crew seasoned, its manifest listing dozens of passengers, businessmen, tourists, families. The transatlantic journey was expected to take just over 18 hours, with scheduled stopovers for fuel. But somewhere over the Atlantic, contact was lost. Radio transmissions ceased mid-flight. Radar screens no longer tracked its progress. Search and rescue operations swept the ocean, but no trace of wreckage was found. After weeks of fruitless searching, the case was closed. Santiago Airlines itself shut down a few years later, leaving the vanished flight as one more unsolved tragedy of the skies. Then, according to accounts that surfaced decades later, something extraordinary occurred. On October 12th, 1989, 35 years after the disappearance, air traffic controllers at Porto Alegre logged an unidentified craft approaching their airspace. Radar placed the blip on a direct course to the airport. Its livery bore the faded but recognizable markings of Santiago Airlines, a company that no longer existed. The aircraft executed a flawless landing. Its engines sputtered, then fell silent on the tarmac. Ground crews approached cautiously, expecting perhaps a museum delivery or a private collector's aircraft. Instead, what they found defied belief. Inside the cabin, every seat was occupied. But the passengers were skeletal, dressed in mid-1950s clothing, their belongings aged but intact. In the cockpit, the same tableau awaited. The crew seated at their stations, uniforms faded, bodies reduced to bone, and yet, the plane had landed under control. Flaps and landing gear had deployed, throttles had been managed. Whoever guided the aircraft to the runway did not step out to be identified. The official story, circulated in newspapers and retellings, spread rapidly. Some dismissed it as fabrication, a tale too grim, too impossible to be accepted. Others insisted the accounts were drawn from local testimony, and reports quickly sealed. The Brazilian government, when pressed, denied any knowledge. Skeptics argue that the story bears hallmarks of legend, similar to maritime ghost ship tales where vessels drift into port crewed only by the dead. No official accident reports list Santiago Airlines Flight 513 as recovered. For many researchers, it remains an urban myth amplified by sensationalist magazines in the late 20th century. And yet, the persistence of the story troubles even the most cautious investigators. It mirrors other phantom flight, the account's aircraft vanishing for years before reappearing, seemingly untouched by time. Pan Am Flight 914. The DC-4 that allegedly re-emerged 37 years after disappearing carries the same eerie pattern. A plane returning from nowhere, passengers unaware or beyond recognition. If the tale of Flight 513 is myth, it speaks to a deeper anxiety in aviation that time itself can sometimes claim a flight path. If it is more than myth, then the questions are even darker. How could a plane disappear in 1954, only to arrive decades later, guided to landing with no living pilot? Whether fact, folklore, or something in between, the story of Santiago Airlines 513 endures. In Porto Alegre, whispers still circulate of the day an impossible aircraft touched down, carrying the skeletal memory of its passengers. And perhaps that is the reason it lingers, because even in an age of radar, satellites, and strict records, there remains room in the skies for the impossible. Controllers in Athens, 2005, watched a Helios Airways 737 deviate from course. When fighters intercepted it, both pilots were unconscious. The jet crashed, but what radar showed before impact, a sudden loop, remains unexplained. The morning of August 14th, 2005 was clear, the Aegean shimmering beneath bright skies. Helios Airways Flight 522. A Boeing 737-300 lifted from Larnaca, Cyprus, bound for Prague with a scheduled stop in Athens. On board were 115 passengers and 6 crew. Among them, families returning from holidays, children, and business travellers heading to Europe. Shortly after takeoff, communication began to falter. When controllers in Nicosia attempted contact, the responses from the cockpit were confused, clipped, and at times incoherent. Within minutes, silence followed. The aircraft continued on autopilot, climbing to 34,000 feet and maintaining course toward Greek airspace. At 10:20 a.m., the plane entered Athens's control zone. Controllers noticed something strange. No verbal response from the crew, but the jet held a steady heading. The decision was made to scramble 2 F-16 fighters from the Hellenic Air Force. As the interceptors closed in, they confirmed the unthinkable. Both pilots sat motionless in the cockpit, oxygen masks dangling unused. Inside the cabin, passengers slumped in their seats, unconscious from hypoxia. The aircraft had become a ghost, flying itself. What caused the disaster soon became clear: a pressurization fault. Investigators later determined the cabin pressurization switch had been left in the manual position after a maintenance check, preventing the system from maintaining safe cabin pressure. At high altitude, oxygen depletion set in within minutes. The pilots, impaired by hypoxia, failed to recognize the symptoms in time, but the radar logs revealed something investigators could not easily explain. Minutes before fuel exhaustion, the 737 performed a brief looping turn. Controllers watching the blip noted it veered sharply, then corrected itself, as though responding to an unseen hand. Autopilot systems are designed to maintain steady flight unless reprogrammed or destabilized by turbulence. Yet weather over the Aegean that morning was calm. Flight recorders, later recovered, offered no command inputs during that loop. The movement, though brief, appeared deliberate. Some speculate that a passenger, briefly conscious after donning a portable oxygen mask, may have attempted to enter the cockpit and take control. One cabin crew member, a flight attendant with some training, was later confirmed to have remained partially alert. Perhaps, in those final minutes, he tried to alter the jet's course. Yet the radar trace suggests more than a simple correction. It shows a tight, unnatural loop before returning to course, a maneuver inconsistent with a novice hand at the controls. Others point to the possibility of autopilot anomalies. Could the system, starved of electrical stability as fuel drained, have produced erratic inputs? Engineers argue that while failure could cause banking or descent, a clean loop would be unlikely without direct command. The official report acknowledged the radar deviation but left it unexplained. For families of the victims, this detail was overshadowed by the greater tragedy. A plane full of passengers, lost to a preventable technical oversight, and yet the anomaly lingers. Controllers who watched the loop in real time insist it was sharp, sudden, and unlike any autopilot drift they had seen. For them, the ghostly blip hinted at something beyond mechanical error, a final movement in skies otherwise calm. Helios Airways Flight 522 ended its journey at 12:03 p.m., crashing into hills north of Athens. There were no survivors, but in the last minutes of its flight, as radar showed a loop with no clear cause, the jet seemed to defy the boundaries of explanation. A final arc across the sky. One last mystery written in the language of blips and silence. July 1937. Amelia Earhart's voice crackled over radio, reporting her position near Howland Island. Minutes later, silence. Despite one of history's largest searches, her flight path remains a blank space. Earhart's final flight was meant to be the crowning achievement of a career built on daring records. Alongside her navigator, Fred Noonan, she was attempting to circumnavigate the globe, a journey of 29.0 miles, stitched together in carefully planned legs across oceans and continents. The Lockheed Electra 10E they flew was a twin-engine aircraft outfitted with additional fuel tanks to carry them across the longest stretches of sea. On the morning of July 1937, they departed Lae, New Guinea, bound for tiny Howland Island in the Central Pacific, a speck of land less than 2 miles long, chosen as a refueling stop on the way to Hawaii. It was the most dangerous leg of the journey. Their flight path required precise navigation across 556 miles of open ocean. U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca waited near Howland, its radios tuned to Earhart's frequency, ready to guide her in. At first, everything seemed routine. Earhart checked in by radio, reporting her position, but as the flight progressed, messages grew tense. She reported difficulty establishing two-way contact with Itasca. The crew on the cutter could hear her, but she could not hear their replies. Without two-way communication, course corrections became nearly impossible. At 7:42 a.m., Earhart's final confirmed message was received. "We are on the line 157-337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6,210 kilocycles. Wait." Her voice, crackling with static, carried urgency but no panic. Moments later, silence. No further transmissions were ever heard. The Itasca scoured the seas, releasing smoke signals in hopes the Electra would see them. Nothing appeared on the horizon. Within hours, the largest search in naval history to that point was underway. Dozens of ships and aircraft swept 250 square miles of ocean. They found nothing, no debris, no oil slick, no trace of Earhart or Noonan. Official explanations have long centered on fuel exhaustion. The Pacific, with depths exceeding 17.0 feet in the region, could easily swallow an aircraft whole. Fragments of alternative evidence continue to emerge. In the 1940s, skeletal remains were found on Nikumaroro, an atoll 400 miles southeast of Howland. Alongside were remnants of a woman's shoe, a sextant box, and a campfire site. Some researchers argue these were Earhart and Noonan's, who may have landed on the atoll and perished awaiting rescue. Others dispute the analysis, noting the remains were later lost and measurements inconclusive. More recently, sonar surveys of the Pacific floor have scanned for the Electra. Some teams claim to have imaged shapes resembling aircraft fuselages in deep trenches, yet no definitive recovery has been made. For aviation historians, what endures is the precision of the mystery. Earhart was a skilled pilot, Noonan an expert navigator, and yet their flight path simply dissolves in the record. The line they claimed, 157-337, is a navigational bearing, but along it lies only ocean and silence. Speculative theories stretch wider. Some suggest Earhart was captured by Japanese forces in the Marshall Islands, her Electra forced down. Others propose disorientation from atmospheric anomalies, where radio signals bent unpredictably, preventing effective triangulation. But beyond theories, the blank space itself speaks loudest. In a sky crisscrossed by charts, maps and routes, Earhart's final path is missing. No wreckage has confirmed it, no survivor has walked back from it. It is an unmarked corridor, erased as though flight itself dissolved into the sea. For the world, Amelia Earhart remains an icon not only of aviation, but of mystery. Her courage carried her into the sky. Her final journey left behind a silence that no search, no archive, and no radar sweep has ever filled. 1989. 90. Belgian airspace lit with reports of silent black triangles, larger than airliners, gliding across night skies. Military jets scrambled. Radar recorded nothing. It began in November of 1989 in the small town of Eupen near the German border. Dozens of residents looked upward and saw a massive object, triangular in shape, drifting slowly across the stars. Its lights, 3 bright orbs at each corner, with a pulsing red light in the centre, glowed against the darkness. Some described it as so large it seemed to blot out the sky, and yet, unlike jets or helicopters, it made no sound. Police officers on patrol were among the first official witnesses. They reported the object moving deliberately, almost hovering, before gliding off toward the horizon. Their testimony, later written into official logs, would prove impossible to dismiss. Over the next weeks, hundreds of reports followed across Belgium, all describing the same thing: vast, silent triangles cruising low over towns and fields. The Belgian Air Force took the matter seriously. By spring 1990, the wave of sightings was so intense that military jets were scrambled on multiple occasions. On March 30th of that year, F-16 fighters launched from Bovchain Air Base in response to radar indications of an unknown object. Pilots pursued blips that appeared suddenly, then vanished without explanation. Instruments showed target locks with impossible maneuvers, accelerations from 150 knots to 10 knots in seconds, far beyond any known aircraft. Yet when the pilots looked with their own eyes, the skies were empty. What unsettled investigators most was the consistency of civilian accounts. Witnesses described the triangles moving slowly, almost leisurely, at altitudes so low they could see the underside. Some said the objects turned silently on their axis, banking like vast gliders without wings. Farmers reported their cattle panicking during flyovers. Entire families watched from gardens and rooftops as the black shapes hovered in silence. The Belgian Air Force, after months of investigation, admitted the phenomenon could not be explained by conventional aircraft. No NATO allies reported operations in Belgian skies. No experimental craft were claimed. The objects left no sonic booms, no exhaust trails, and no heat signatures. And though radar sometimes registered their presence, at other times it recorded nothing at all. Skeptics suggested mass hysteria, a society primed by media stories, seeing patterns in stars and aircraft lights. Others argued for misidentified helicopters or stealth aircraft, though the scale, silence, and maneuverability described did not align. Photographs taken during the wave, some showing distinct triangular silhouettes, were later dismissed by skeptics as hoaxes, but the sheer volume of reports, from ordinary citizens to trained police officers, kept the case alive. For those in the cockpit of the F-16s, the pursuit was especially haunting. To have instruments insist on the presence of a target, moving with physics-defying acceleration, while their eyes saw only darkness, it raised the possibility of phenomena operating beyond detection or beyond understanding. The wave gradually subsided by 1991, leaving behind stacks of testimony, radar logs, and unanswered questions. Official reports concluded that no hostile threat had been present, but stopped short of declaring the sightings explained. Today, the Belgian Triangle remains one of the most well-documented aerial anomalies in European history. Unlike isolated UFO encounters, it was prolonged, widespread, and witnessed by both civilians and military personnel. And at its core lies a contradiction. Massive objects seen clearly by thousands, yet invisible to radar when jets scrambled to intercept. In the quiet towns of Belgium, residents still recall the nights when the sky seemed to open and reveal vast, silent aircraft without engines. Flight paths without explanation, gliding across their lives before vanishing once more into the dark. Washington, D.C. controllers in July 1952 tracked multiple blips hovering over the capital. Jets scrambled, but each time, the lights vanished. The radar operator's logs read like a ghost story. The summer of 1952 was hot and humid in the capital. The kind of July where air hung heavy over the Potomac. In the control tower of Washington National Airport, technicians stared at glowing radar screens that should have displayed routine air traffic. Instead, on the night of July 19th, they watched as unknown blips flickered into existence, not one, but several, scattered across the restricted skies above the capital itself. Controllers checked their instruments. Faults were possible, but the radar scopes had been tested and recalibrated days earlier. The blips moved deliberately, accelerating, slowing, and even hovering in place maneuvers far beyond conventional aircraft. When visual confirmation was sought, the controllers themselves stepped outside and looked skyward. There, against the stars, they saw bright lights moving silently, perfectly in line with what radar suggested. Within hours, Andrews Air Force Base was alerted. Jets were scrambled to intercept. Pilots roared into the night, guided toward the positions where radar placed the objects. But each time the fighters approached, the blips faded. The sky appeared empty, the lights gone. When the jets returned to base, the blips returned as well, reappearing on radar as though mocking the pursuit. The incident repeated itself a week later, on July 26th. Again, multiple radar stations across the capital tracked unknown targets. Again, visual observers on the ground reported strange lights darting and hovering. And again, jets sent to intercept saw nothing but empty sky. For radar operators, the events were chilling. Their logs, preserved in official reports, described targets accelerating at thousands of miles per hour, stopping abruptly and vanishing. No known aircraft of the time could perform such maneuvers, nor could weather explain the consistency. The Air Force launched an investigation, eventually attributing the sightings to a phenomenon known as temperature inversion layers of warm air trapped above cooler air, bending radar beams in ways that could create false returns. To the public, it was presented as an atmospheric quirk, yet many operators were unconvinced. They had seen inversions before. Those typically created fuzzy, inconsistent echoes. What they witnessed in July 1952 were sharp, coherent blips moving in deliberate paths. And their eyes had confirmed what the screens showed: lights maneuvering over the most protected airspace in the United States. The press seized on the story. Headlines spoke of flying saucers over Washington, and the wave of attention forced officials to hold one of the largest press conferences in Air Force history. Reassurances were offered, but questions lingered. If temperature inversion explained the radar returns, what explained the lights witnessed from the ground? And why did the unknowns vanish whenever fighters approached, only to reappear once the skies were clear again? Historians later dubbed the events the Washington Flap of 1952, one of the most famous mass sightings in modern aviation history. For a capital city still gripped by Cold War anxieties, the notion of objects intruding on restricted skies undetected until too late was unsettling. What remains most haunting are the words in the logs themselves. Operators describe the events with the detachment of professionals, yet the unease bleeds through. Targets disappeared when interceptors closed. One entry notes, another records simply unidentified. Maneuvers not explainable. The skies over Washington eventually returned to normal, but the summer of 1952 left a gap in certainty. Officially, the lights were illusions, tricks of temperature and reflection. Unofficially, many of those who watched the screens that night believed they had seen corridors of air, opened briefly above the capital paths traveled by craft beyond radar, beyond explanation, and gone as quickly as they came. In the 1970s, Argentine researchers flying over Antarctica reported a sudden shift in instruments. Compasses spun, and the sun appeared in the wrong position. Their logs recorded coordinates that no map supported. Antarctica has always tested the limits of navigation. Magnetic compasses grow unreliable near the South Pole, where lines of force converge. Aircraft rely on gyroscopic instruments, dead reckoning, and celestial fixes. But in 1978, one Argentine Air Force flight recorded anomalies so severe that they defied both training and charts. The mission was routine, a Fairchild F-27 transporting personnel between Antarctic bases. The crew included scientists accustomed to the region's peculiar conditions. At first, everything appeared normal. Smooth flight over a frozen expanse of white, the horizon glowing with summer sun that never truly set. Then, without warning, the aircraft's compasses began to spin. The needles rotated erratically, refusing to hold steady. The pilots switched to gyroscopic backup. At first, the horizon indicator stabilized them, but soon even gyros drifted, as though some unseen force had disrupted their spin. More unnerving was the position of the Sunday crew members swore it had shifted, appearing several degrees off where it should have been by both time and chart. For navigators used to fixing bearings by celestial reference, the effect was disorienting. Radio contact with base also grew faint, filled with bursts of static unusual for clear Antarctic skies. When coordinates were logged, they did not match any known map points. The plane, by its own instruments, seemed to be flying over terrain that should not exist. Grid references fell into open ocean, where the charts showed no land, or across blank stretches where mountains should have been. The anomaly lasted nearly 20 minutes, before abruptly correcting. Compasses steadied, gyros realigned, and the sun appeared where it belonged. The crew regained contact with base and continued on course, landing safely. No one was harmed, yet the logs preserved the unsettling details. Spinning instruments, displaced sun, impossible coordinates. Investigators reviewed the case. Some proposed strong local magnetic anomalies, the pockets of ferrous deposits buried under the ice capable of distorting compasses. Such fields exist in Antarctica, but rarely with enough power to overwhelm gyroscopes or radio transmissions. Others suggested solar activity. Geomagnetic storms from the sun can disrupt navigation and radio, yet space weather records from that day showed no significant disturbances. More speculative explanations followed. Some scientists theorized optical distortions, a product of unusual atmospheric refraction in the polar twilight. Under rare conditions, the sun can appear displaced by superior mirages, false positions created by layers of cold and warm air bending light. Still, this could not explain why the aircraft's instruments also disagreed. Among the crew, quieter theories circulated. That they had entered a kind of corridor, a place where geography itself shifted. The idea of phantom land is not unique to Antarctica. Early explorers often charted islands that later vanished from maps, perhaps mirages, perhaps something more. In this case, Argentine pilots logged coordinates that still plot to blank ocean today. The incident never gained international attention. It remained buried in aviation records, one of many anomalies encountered in the polar skies. But to those who flew that mission, it was unforgettable. Instruments do not all fail at once without cause. Suns do not move in the sky. Maps do not register places that aren't there. And yet, for 20 minutes in the 1970s they did. The Antarctic remains one of Earth's least explored frontiers, its ice concealing mountains taller than the Alps and valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon. In such a place, perhaps it is unsurprising that skies too hold mysteries corridors where compasses spin, suns shift, and flight paths cross into territories no chart has ever drawn. 966. Australia, 1966. Witnesses described jets passing overhead in perfect formation. Yet no sound followed. RAAF records listed no flights that day. The reports came from a rural township in Victoria, where clear skies made even distant aircraft visible for miles. That afternoon, dozens of residents, farmers in fields, children walking home from school, shopkeepers standing in doorways, all looked up at the same time. Against the blue, a formation of 4 silver jets glided overhead, wings flashing in the Sunday. Their movement was steady, their alignment precise, as though flown by trained military pilots. What unsettled the witnesses was not what they saw, but what they didn't hear. No roar of engines followed the craft. no distant thunder of turbines rolling across the countryside. The jets passed in complete silence, leaving no contrails, no atmospheric trace. When local newspapers covered the story, the details were consistent. Residents swore the planes resembled Royal Australian Air Force Sabres, the swept-wing fighters common in the mid-1960s. Their size and formation matched military precision. Yet the silence was total. For machines designed to pierce the sound barrier, such absence was impossible. Curious reporters contacted the RAAF. Officials confirmed no scheduled flights in the region that day. Training exercises had not been authorized. Bases nearby reported no aircraft in the air. The skies, by official record, were empty. The phenomenon was not unique. Scattered reports across the decade told of phantom jets, aircraft seen but not heard, moving in formations or solo flights. Some were described as moving faster than any conventional aircraft, vanishing in seconds. Others, like the Victorian case, moved slowly and visibly, their details clear enough to identify wing markings and fuselage lines. Always, however, they remained silent. Aviation specialists struggled to explain. Jet engines cannot operate without producing tremendous noise, particularly in low-altitude flight. Even experimental aircraft of the 1960s left audible signatures. The idea of silent propulsion belonged to speculative science, not operational fleets. Skeptics argued the witnesses may have misjudged distance, that the aircraft was so high their sound lagged behind. Residents said the jets flew low enough that cockpit canopies and wing profiles were distinct. No delayed roar followed. Silence persisted long after the formation passed. Theories soon stretched into stranger territory. Some suggested atmospheric anomalies, conditions where temperature layers bent and muffled sound, cloaking even the thunder of engines. Such inversions can occur, but rarely erase noise so completely. Others whispered of experimental propulsion systems craft, powered by mechanisms still undisclosed, gliding without conventional exhaust. Still others compared the case to phantom airship sightings of earlier decades. Could these have been echoes, glimpses of flights occurring in another corridor of time, visible but not audible in our own? The Victoria case remained unsolved. For those who watched, the memory endured 4 silver jets, flying as if real, yet stripped of the one element that made them unmistakably earthly. Decades later, the story still circulates quietly among aviation circles in Australia. Pilots occasionally mention their own brush, with silence lights moving across the night sky in formation, gliding without sound. Whether coincidence, illusion, or something more, the pattern remains. Aircraft seen, aircraft denied, and skies that refuse to align with records. The soundless jets of 1966 are remembered less for their appearance than for their absence. The absence of thunder, of records, of explanation. And perhaps that is why the story endures. For in aviation, silence is often more alarming than noise. 1942. Anti-aircraft batteries fired on luminous objects above Los Angeles. Pilots reported no aircraft in the air. The lights shifted silently, then vanished into the Pacific. It was the early hours of February 25th, 1942. The United States was just weeks into its entry into the Second World War, and nerves along the West Coast were frayed. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shocked the nation, and rumors of Japanese strikes against California filled newspapers. That night, air raid sirens wailed across Los Angeles, plunging the city into blackout. Spotlights scanned the skies, their beams converging on strange luminous objects drifting above the city. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, unleashing over 400 rounds into the night. Tracers arced upward, explosions thundered, and shrapnel rained onto streets below. Yet, when the smoke cleared, no wreckage fell. No enemy aircraft were ever identified. The lights themselves, drifting slowly, shifted positions and then faded westward toward the Pacific, leaving only silence. Eyewitnesses across Los Angeles described the same scene: glowing shapes, some circular, some elongated, moving deliberately but without sound. Their pale light contrasted against the search beams that locked onto them. Residents huddled in basements as the barrage rumbled overhead, convinced an invasion was underway. Pilots scrambled to intercept, found nothing. Radar operators logged ambiguous returns, some fleeting, others steady, but none confirmed as hostile craft. The army initially declared the incident a false alarm, triggered by nerves and weather balloons. Later, officials suggested unidentified aircraft might have been scouting the coast, but no evidence ever surfaced. The press dubbed it the Battle of Los Angeles. Photographs published the next morning showed beams of light converging on a glowing mass in the sky, surrounded by bursts of flak. The image became iconic, fueling speculation for decades. What troubled investigators was the persistence of the sightings. Weather balloons could drift, but not in formation. Anti-aircraft crews, trained to identify friendly and hostile silhouettes, insisted the lights moved with purpose. Civilian reports mirrored theirs. One resident near Santa Monica recalled, "It was no balloon. It shifted sideways against the wind, then climbed, then stopped." Historians have revisited the case often. Some argue the barrage was triggered by a combination of radar anomalies and tension, with ordinary lights mistaken for threats. Others point to atmospheric conditions, coastal fog refracting searchlights, creating illusions of luminous objects. Yet the official explanations never matched the precision of what so many saw. For aviation researchers, the silence was the most disturbing detail. Yet witnesses agreed the objects above Los Angeles moved soundlessly, immune to the hail of fire below. Theories have since multiplied. Some suggest secret Japanese reconnaissance craft, though no records confirm such flights. Others speculate about advanced technologies, machines that could appear on radar, yet leave no wreckage when struck by anti-aircraft shells. A few whisper of objects not belonging to any nation, slipping briefly into human airspace before departing over the ocean. What endures is the fact that nothing was ever recovered. Despite the thousands of witnesses, the photographs, the logs, and the immense firepower expended, no fragments of balloon, plane, or machinery were ever found in Los Angeles that morning. The city was shaken, but empty-handed. Today, the Battle of Los Angeles stands as one of the most perplexing aerial incidents of the Second World War. Official files remain inconclusive, caught between explanations of hysteria and the stubborn details of the reports. For those who lived through it, the memory is sharp. Luminous shapes drifting above a darkened city, immune to fire, silent in the air, vanishing at last into the Pacific night. Mountaineers in Switzerland described a silent glider, tracing valleys at impossible speed. Aviation records list no flights. Weeks later, climbers found no wreckage. The Alps are no stranger to aircraft. In summer, gliders ride thermals between sharp peaks, their white wings cutting against blue sky. The silence of unpowered flight is familiar to those who hike the high passes. But in the winter of 1972, a group of Swiss mountaineers witnessed something that defied both aviation and geography. The team was ascending near the Aletsch Glacier when one climber noticed movement far below. Against the snow, a long-winged craft traced the valley floor, banking smoothly from ridge to ridge. It resembled a glider narrow fuselage, long slender wings, yet it moved with astonishing speed, covering miles in seconds. The mountaineers expected to hear the whistle of air passing over the wings, but there was nothing. The machine was utterly silent. They watched it sweep through the valley, turn sharply without losing altitude, and vanish into cloud near the Jungfrau Peak. Later, at base, they checked air traffic reports. No gliders had been cleared to fly that day. In winter, thermals are rare and conditions dangerous. The Civil Aviation Office confirmed no flight plans, no registered glider competitions, nothing airborne in that sector. Word of the sighting spread. Other climbers reported seeing the same craft in subsequent weeks, a gleaming shape moving through narrow passes at speeds far beyond any known sailplane. Always silent, always vanishing into cloud or snow. Some swore it left faint shimmering trails in the air, like heat haze, though no exhaust or contrail followed. Searchers were mounted in the valleys, climbers scanned for wreckage, convinced such reckless maneuvers would eventually end in disaster. Yet nothing was ever found. No broken wings on glacier ice, no fuselage buried in crevasse fields, no distress calls received by mountain rescue. The mystery deepened When seasoned glider pilots were shown sketches from witnesses, they agreed the craft looked like a modern sailplane but noted details that didn't align wings proportionally too long. Tail structure unfamiliar. Canopy tinted in a way not common to 1970s gliders. And even the fastest competitive gliders of the era could not reach the speeds described by climbers, especially at low altitudes in narrow valleys. Speculative theories soon followed. Some suggested the Ghost glider was an experimental craft tested in secret, using propulsion systems designed to mask sound. But no manufacturer admitted to trials, and Switzerland's neutral airspace would have made such incursions politically dangerous. Others proposed atmospheric illusions, unusual light refractions in cold alpine air, perhaps reflections of distant aircraft distorted against snow and cloud. But illusions cannot bank, maneuver, and vanish with precision seen from multiple angles. A few whispered older folklore of phantom planes that haunt the Alps. Echoes of wartime aircraft lost in storms, replaying their final flights in silence. During both World Wars, dozens of planes had crashed among these peaks, some still hidden beneath ice. Could the glider have been a spectral echo of such tragedies? Officially, the Swiss aviation authorities closed the case as unverified reports. Unofficially, the mountaineers who saw it never forgot. For them, it was not illusion nor rumour, but a memory carved as sharply as the ridges themselves. A silent craft, too fast for the valleys, carving paths where no pilot dared. Today, the story lingers among alpine guides. Some still claim to have seen a flash of white wings in the distance, sweeping between peaks where no aircraft could safely fly. No sound follows, no wreckage remains, only the fleeting impression of speed in silence. The Ghost glider of the Alps endures not because it left debris, but because it left none a path across mountains drawn without trace, a flight that should not exist. Off Japan's coast lies a region where fishing vessels vanish. Japanese naval records describe aircraft reporting sudden compass failures before vanishing from radar. The area is known in Japan as the Ma no Umi, the Sea of the Devil. Westerners call it the Dragon's Triangle. Stretching roughly from Japan's east coast to Guam and down into the Philippine Sea, it mirrors the Bermuda Triangle in both reputation and reports. For centuries, fishermen have whispered of waters where compasses fail, skies turn strange, and ships slip silently beneath the waves without leaving wreckage. In the 1950s, the Japanese government launched formal studies after 5 military vessels disappeared in the region, claiming hundreds of sailors. Their last radio calls mentioned nothing unusual, just routine reports of position. The losses were so severe that authorities officially declared the area a danger zone, discouraging further military patrols. But it was not only ships. Japanese naval archives include accounts of aircraft that entered the triangle and failed to return. Pilots transmitted confusion as their compasses spun erratically. Artificial horizons drifted, and radio channels filled with static. Radar operators tracked some of these planes as they deviated from course, circling into impossible loops before vanishing entirely from the screen. Civilian accounts echo the same. Fishermen describe skies darkening without warning, sudden walls of fog, and luminous shapes appearing above the waterline. Some recount hearing engines from above, though no aircraft could be seen. Scientists have offered several explanations. The region is geologically unstable, lying along the Pacific Ring of Fire. Submarine volcanic activity can create bubbles of gas rising through the ocean, reducing water density and causing ships to sink rapidly without warning or trace. Magnetic anomalies caused by vast mineral deposits beneath the seabed could, in theory, disrupt compasses and confuse navigation. And unusual atmospheric refractions could bend radar and radio waves, creating illusions of distance and position. Yet these explanations fall short when all are considered together. Gas vents may sink ships, but they do not cause aircraft compasses to spin. Magnetic shifts might affect navigation, but they cannot erase radar returns entirely. And atmospheric distortion does not explain centuries of vanishing vessels in calm weather. For some, the Dragon's Triangle represents more than geology. Folklore ties it to dragons rising from the sea, guardians of hidden realms. Modern theorists compare it directly to the Bermuda Triangle, suggesting both regions may be windows into electromagnetic corridors where time and space distort. The symmetry between them, one in the Atlantic, one in the Pacific, is difficult to ignore. In 1952, a Japanese research vessel sent to investigate the disappearances also vanished. It carried over 30 scientists tasked with charting the anomaly. Their ship was never recovered. After this, the government quietly ended its studies, declaring the area off-limits to official expeditions. Today, shipping routes skirt the zone. Though commercial aircraft still pass overhead, pilots occasionally log minor compass fluctuations and bursts of static, though none in recent decades have been lost. Still, the reputation endures. Locals warn fishermen not to stray too far, and maps, though modern, still mark the region with caution. The Dragon's Triangle remains a reminder that oceans hold corridors we do not fully understand, waters where ships sink without distress, skies where aircraft vanish without trace, and charts where the only certainty is uncertainty itself. A path exists there, but it is a path that should not, by any measure, exist at all. Pilots over the Atlantic have long described sonic booms with no source. Instruments record no jets, yet entire crews report shockwaves through the fuselage. The first reports date back decades, long before supersonic flight became routine. In the 1940s, Allied crews ferrying bombers across the Atlantic logged sudden concussive jolts that rattled their aircraft. At first, they assumed hostile fighters, but the skies around them were clear. Radar screens empty, their formations remained intact, yet each crew confirmed the same explosive pressure rolling across their fuselages. The unmistakable sensation of a sonic boom. By the 1960s, commercial airliners had begun encountering the same. Captains described sharp vibrations through the cabin, coffee cups rattling, passengers startled by sudden shudders. Cockpit instruments showed no turbulence. Weather reports marked calm skies, and yet, outside the windows, there were no aircraft, no Concorde on parallel route, no military jets breaking the sound barrier. The skies remained officially empty. The phenomenon earned a name: skyquakes. Like their terrestrial counterparts, these unexplained shockwaves occurred without visible cause. Crews likened them to invisible corridors of compressed air striking the fuselage, then vanishing as quickly as they appeared. The US Coast Guard recorded several such incidents off the eastern seaboard. Residents along the Carolinas and New Jersey coast reported loud rolling booms that rattled windows, prompting fears of offshore explosions. Yet naval patrols confirmed no detonations, no supersonic test flights in the region. The sound, like thunder, had no storm to anchor it. For pilots, the Atlantic encounters were stranger still. On transoceanic routes, reports accumulated, wide-bodied jets flying steady at 0 feet. Passengers felt the cabin vibrate, sometimes for seconds, sometimes for longer. Flight recorders captured no anomalies. Instruments logged no wind shear, no turbulence, no engine surges. The only evidence was human memory, confirmed by dozens of witnesses aboard the same flights. Scientists offered possible explanations. One theory suggested atmospheric ducting layers of warm and cold air refracting sound from distant supersonic flights, carrying the boom thousands of miles. But this could not explain why shockwaves physically jolted aircraft mid-flight, where sound alone should have passed harmlessly. Others proposed microseismic events, undersea earthquakes sending pressure waves into the atmosphere. Such events are real, but their strength diminishes rapidly. None should be strong enough to rattle jetliners thousands of feet above the ocean. More speculative ideas suggest pockets of high-density air in visible zones, where pressure changes suddenly, striking fuselages like an unseen hand. Yet unlike turbulence, which is measurable and predictable, skyquakes leave no trace on instruments. The accounts stretch into modern times. In 2013, an Airbus A330 en route from Lisbon to New York reported a sudden double shock, the cabin vibrating violently though weather remained clear. Passengers assumed a mid-air collision was imminent, but the crew saw nothing outside, and radar showed no traffic within 100 miles. The flight continued smoothly. For those who experience it, the phenomenon leaves an unease greater than turbulence. Turbulence can be explained, forecasted, understood. Skyquakes offer no cause, only the undeniable memory of something immense passing through the air unseen. Some aviation researchers whisper of phantom corridors, invisible flight paths of objects moving faster than known craft, leaving shockwaves without presence. If true, then the Atlantic may hold routes shared not only by our aircraft, but by others we cannot yet detect. For now, skyquakes remain an unresolved footnote in aviation logs. Crews note them, passengers remember them, but instruments insist nothing happened, and perhaps that is the mystery's essence. Shockwaves that leave no source, sound without origin, invisible companions crossing our skies. In 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 crashed moments after takeoff. Yet witnesses reported lights and fireballs in the sky, inconsistent with mechanical failure alone. On May 25, 1979, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 prepared for departure from Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The aircraft, bound for Los Angeles, carried 258 passengers and 13 crew. Weather was clear, visibility good, and nothing suggested the tragedy about to unfold. At 3:02 p.m., Flight 191 accelerated down runway 32R and lifted into the air. Seconds later, disaster struck. The left engine separated from the wing, tearing hydraulic lines and damaging systems as it ripped away. The aircraft rolled violently, lost lift, and crashed into a field less than a mile from the runway. All 271 aboard were killed, along with 2 people on the ground. It remains the deadliest aviation accident on US soil. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation traced the cause to improper maintenance. Mechanics, working on the DC-10's engines weeks before, had used a forklift procedure not approved by the manufacturer. The maneuver damaged the pylon assembly that secured the engine to the wing. The fracture grew worse with every flight, until, on that afternoon, the mounting failed completely. But while the official report explained the mechanical sequence, eyewitnesses described details that still puzzle investigators. Dozens of people around O'Hare reported not just the engine separation, but strange lights in the sky. Some described them as glowing orbs pacing the aircraft, others as fireballs streaking ahead before the jet rolled. Several insisted the lights appeared before the aircraft began its final dive. One mechanic stationed near the runway told reporters he saw a flash like a flare above the left wing moments before the engine detached. Another witness, standing in a parking lot, swore multiple luminous objects crossed above the jet at impossible speed, vanishing into cloud. These accounts were filed, but quietly set aside as stress-induced misperceptions in the chaos of a catastrophic accident. Yet the testimonies fit a wider pattern. In aviation history, several disasters are preceded by reports of unusual lights, often described by crews or ground observers in the seconds or minutes before impact. Known colloquially as disaster lights, they appear with no radar confirmation, no consistent shape, only a fleeting brilliance. Some researchers speculate they may be forms of atmospheric plasma triggered by intense stress on metal structures, while others believe they could represent electromagnetic anomalies, luminous discharges born of unseen forces. In the case of Flight 191, the phenomenon remains unexplained. The separation of an engine, while catastrophic, does not produce fireballs in the sky or lights streaking ahead of the aircraft. Nor does it account for witnesses who describe the orbs as distant from the jet itself. Adding to the lore are reports in the years following the crash. Employees at O'Hare and the nearby hotels occasionally spoke of strange encounters. Shadowy figures seen near the crash site, glowing shapes in the distance at night, and voices heard in quiet terminals after hours. Some dismissed these as ghost stories born of tragedy, yet the tales persisted, becoming part of the folklore surrounding Flight 191. What endures, however, is the contradiction between the hard mechanics of the official report and the softer, stranger testimonies of those who stood on the ground that day. A jet crashed because of a fractured pylon, and yet, as it fell, lights appeared in the sky that no engineer, no inspector has ever explained. For aviation, Flight 191 is a case study in maintenance failure. For mystery, it remains something more. A disaster marked not only by tragedy, but by phenomena outside the language of engineering. The engine's fall was understood. The lights were not. 1946, Scandinavia. Pilots and radar operators recorded ghost rockets streaking silently through skies, No debris was found. It began in the summer months, when Scandinavian skies remain pale long after midnight. From Sweden to Finland, Norway to Denmark, witnesses looked upward and saw elongated shapes cutting across the horizon. They resembled missiles, narrow bodies trailing faint sparks, but unlike artillery or meteor fireballs, these objects moved steadily, silently, and often horizontally before dissolving into cloud. The first sightings came in February, but by August reports had multiplied into the hundreds. Military pilots intercepted what they could, sometimes closing distance only to watch the objects vanish before them. Radar operators tracked unidentified returns, blips that crossed hundreds of kilometers in minutes, then stopped abruptly, hanging in place, before vanishing altogether. Newspapers dubbed them Spökraketer ghost rockets. The term captured the contradiction. They behaved like projectiles, yet produced no detonations. They looked metallic, yet left no fragments. When some appeared to fall into lakes, divers were sent to search. Nothing was ever recovered. The timing was unsettling. The Second World War had ended less than a year earlier. Many assumed the objects were Soviet tests, captured German V-2 technology, adapted for long-range trials. Swedish authorities took this theory seriously, recovering radar logs and eyewitness testimony in the belief that foreign powers were probing Scandinavian skies. But no evidence of Soviet launches matched the dates, nor did the observed behavior align with known rocketry. V-2 missiles, when fired, left thunderous noise and debris. These objects made no sound at all. Scientific commissions considered natural explanations. Meteors are common in summer, especially during annual showers, but meteors burn quickly, their arcs brief and brilliant. The ghost rockets lingered, flying level for minutes at a time. Some even appeared to maneuver banking, slowing, or changing direction against winds. Witnesses from Swedish Air Force squadrons insisted they saw metallic fuselages glinting in twilight. One pilot described a cigar-shaped craft, silver against the horizon, leaving a thin vapor trail, but no flame. Another radar officer noted, it behaved like an aircraft, but with the speed of a projectile. Public concern grew as reports spread. In total, over 0 sightings were documented across Scandinavia in 1,946. Hundreds included corroboration from military or radar sources. Yet despite exhaustive searches, not a single engine, fragment or casing was found. The Swedish government, under pressure, released a statement acknowledging the phenomenon but declining to provide a cause. Privately, classified memos admitted investigators were baffled. One report concluded, "These are real physical objects, the nature of which is unknown." As quickly as they came, the sightings faded. By autumn, the skies quieted. A few isolated reports trickled in the following year, but the great wave of ghost rockets had passed. What remained were thousands of testimonies, dozens of radar logs, and no physical proof. Some researchers argue the ghost rockets were the first wave of what would later be called unidentified aerial phenomena. Their shapes, speeds, and silences echoed later accounts of cigar craft in the 1950s and beyond. Others still hold to the Soviet test theory, despite the lack of wreckage, but perhaps the most haunting detail lies in the lakes. Multiple reports described rockets plunging into water without sound. Divers found only silt, no fragments, no impact craters. It was as if the objects entered one world, then left it again, through corridors we cannot map. The ghost rockets of 1946 remind us that even in skies thick with post-war vigilance, mysteries appeared uninvited streaks of silver that left no noise, no debris, only silence. And silence, sometimes, is the most troubling record of all. Pilots approaching San Juan report sudden instrument failure, compasses spinning without cause. For decades, the Puerto Rico Trench has been linked with anomalies no engineer can explain. The trench, the deepest point in the Atlantic Ocean, plunges more than 0 feet below the surface and lies just north of Puerto Rico, marking the boundary between the Caribbean and North American tectonic plates. Its geology is extreme, shaped by seismic shifts and constant undersea activity, and the region above it has earned a reputation as one of the most unpredictable stretches of sky in aviation. For as long as records have been kept, pilots descending into Luis Muñoz Marin International Airport have logged cases of compasses whirling suddenly, altimeters disagreeing, and radio static bursting without warning. Some describe the sensation of instruments being pulled in two directions at once, as if an invisible hand had disrupted the delicate alignment of their navigation systems. One of the earliest documented cases dates back to the 1940s, when Navy patrol aircraft reported magnetic deviation while flying anti-submarine missions over the trench. Crews logged compass swings of up to 30 degrees despite calm weather and steady heading. Yet when survey flights attempted to replicate the readings, the instruments held steady, leaving no permanent trace of the anomalies. Commercial crews in later decades reported the same. A Pan Am flight in the 1950s descending towards San Juan logged sudden loss of directional gyro stability. The compass spun in circles, forcing the crew to fly visually until it stabilized. In the 1970s, a cargo pilot described both his primary and backup compasses drifting opposite each other, one pointing north while the other indicated south, a contradiction that cleared only once the aircraft exited the area. For passengers, the effects were often invisible, smooth flights with only occasional delay in arrival times. But for the men and women in the cockpit, the trench became a place where instruments could not always be trusted. The Puerto Rico Trench lies within the so-called Bermuda Triangle, a region already linked in popular culture to vanishings and navigational mysteries. And while many of those stories are exaggerated, the accounts near San Juan are grounded in official logs and cockpit records. The trench's geology provides a partial explanation. Magnetic anomalies are known to exist near tectonic boundaries, where iron-rich rocks interact with shifting plates. Sudden movements under the ocean can release pulses of energy, potentially disrupting compasses. Yet these effects are usually small, measured in minor deviations, not wild swings. Engineers investigating airline reports admitted the anomalies were greater than expected for natural causes. Theories extended further. Some meteorologists pointed to the unique atmospheric conditions over the Caribbean, where hot trade winds, cool ocean currents, and frequent thunderstorms collide. These can generate powerful electromagnetic fields, occasionally strong enough to interfere with cockpit electronics. But pilots countered that the anomalies often occurred in clear weather, with no storm cells within hundreds of miles. The trench seemed to generate its own disturbances, independent of visible sky conditions. Stories accumulated. In the 1980s, a corporate jet approaching San Juan logged total radio blackout for several minutes while instruments froze at impossible values, altimeter stuck at 12.0 feet while the aircraft was visibly descending toward the island. When the systems cleared, the flight resumed normally, leaving only confused data in the logbook. In the 1990s, several regional airlines reported repeated compass disturbances in the same corridor, prompting quiet advisories among pilots to trust your eyes more than your needles when approaching from the north. Crews in the 2000s have described GPS signals vanishing for several minutes over the trench, with navigation reverting to inertial systems until satellites locked again. Engineers suggest signal refraction from atmospheric layers or multipath reflection off ocean surfaces. But the consistency of the location makes the explanations unsatisfying. The anomaly is not random, it belongs to that particular stretch of sky. Folklore has grown around it. Fishermen in Puerto Rico have long spoken of strange lights over the northern horizon, glowing spheres hovering above the sea. Sailors once described compasses faltering as ships passed over the trench, pointing toward invisible poles beneath the ocean. Legends tied the region to gates passages, where time and direction bent briefly before restoring themselves. The aviation reports seem like modern echoes of those tales. For pilots, the anomalies are unsettling not because they cause accidents, but because they erode certainty. In aviation, instruments are truth. A spinning compass, a frozen altimeter, a silent radio. These are not just inconveniences, but reminders that even in controlled skies, there are places where order can collapse. And yet, flights continue daily into San Juan, with thousands of passengers crossing the trench without incident. To most, the approach is unremarkable, a view of turquoise waters and green volcanic peaks. Only in the cockpit, where instruments are watched closely, Do the old anomalies sometimes return? Brief glitches that leave crews exchanging quiet glances. The Puerto Rico Trench remains one of the least understood regions of the Atlantic. Pilots still file occasional reports of spinning compasses and lagging clocks, always in the same narrow corridor, always unexplained by post-flight checks. Engineers continue to investigate, but no reproducible cause has been confirmed, and so the magnetic skies of Puerto Rico persist as both scientific puzzle and whispered legend, a place where geology, weather, and folklore converge, and where, for reasons no one can fully explain, aircraft instruments lose their anchor, spinning wildly as though caught between unseen forces. For those who fly there, the experience is less dramatic than myth, but more disturbing than malfunction, a reminder that even in the jet age there remain skies where the rules waver, and where the compass, humanity's most ancient tool of navigation, refuses, for a few uncanny moments, to tell the truth. Over Phoenix. In 1997, pilots logged vast, triangular objects pacing their aircraft. They moved silently, casting shadows larger than runways. Civilian reports flooded in. Radar, once again, showed nothing. The night of March 13th, 1997, would become one of the most documented mass sighting events in modern aviation history, known today as the Phoenix Lights. It began just after sunset, when residents across Nevada, Arizona, and parts of Mexico looked skyward and reported formations of lights moving with uncanny precision. Pilots flying commercial routes in the region described triangular silhouettes vast enough to blot stars from the sky, moving slowly and silently, their undersides lined with steady orbs of light. Unlike conventional aircraft, these objects produced no engine roar, no jet wash, no blinking navigation beacons, and yet they maintained formation with mathematical steadiness. To those on the ground, they appeared immense, larger than football fields, drifting at low altitude over highways and neighborhoods. Reports estimate thousands of witnesses, from suburban families to police officers to military personnel off duty, all describing essentially the same thing: black, triangular shapes moving in silence across the desert sky. For pilots in the air that evening, the encounters were no less disturbing. Several logged sightings of objects pacing their aircraft, moving alongside them at distances difficult to judge but undeniably vast in scale. The triangles moved with slow, deliberate speed, far below what was typical for military jets in formation. And yet, they did not waver. Crews noted that they seemed to cast shadows across the ground below, immense shapes passing over city grids and open desert alike. Radar screens showed clear skies, traffic controllers logged no anomalous returns, and military installations monitoring the region denied tracking any unknown craft. This absence of confirmation only deepened the mystery, for the objects were witnessed by thousands and yet officially invisible. Civilian reports poured into hotlines and local law enforcement. Drivers along highways pulled their cars to the side to watch the triangles drift overhead. Some described them as so large they blocked entire swaths of the sky, their edges stretching from horizon to horizon. Others said the lights at their undersides glowed with a steady, almost amber hue. Unlike the flashing strobes of known aircraft, witnesses consistently described silence. No hum of engines, no vibration, nothing but stillness as the objects glided above. One former police officer compared the experience to standing under a roof that moved with the speed of a walking man, a vast structure crossing the sky without a sound. Among the most compelling accounts came from commercial pilots who logged their encounters formally. These men and women, trained to judge distance, altitude, and motion, described structured craft, not mere lights. They spoke of triangular shapes holding course with their own jets, sometimes for minutes at a time, before drifting away into the darkness. Yet even with precise pilot testimony, the radar remained stubbornly blank. Explanations varied. Some suggested secret military projects, experimental aircraft tested in the vast training ranges of the Southwest. The triangular shape bore resemblance to stealth programs, and whispers of prototypes larger than conventional bombers circulated in aerospace circles. But such explanations faltered under the scale described. Witnesses spoke of objects larger than stadiums, moving too slowly to maintain lift under known aerodynamic principles, and doing so without sound. Others suggested atmospheric illusions, stars refracted through layers of desert air. Yet such theories collapsed against the sheer number of witnesses. Their consistent descriptions and the fact that entire neighborhoods saw solid shapes block out constellations as they passed overhead. More speculative voices suggested something stranger corridors of sky shared with unknown craft, vessels capable of masking their presence on radar while visible to the naked eye. If true, then the skies above Phoenix that night briefly revealed pathways normally hidden, routes traversed by objects beyond our detection. The event gained national attention when local media covered the deluge of reports, and soon it entered popular culture as one of the most famous UFO sightings in history. Government officials initially dismissed the lights as military flares dropped during training exercises, their glow drifting on high winds to create the illusion of structured craft. Yet this explanation failed to account for pilot reports of immense triangular shadows pacing aircraft, or the silence described by thousands who stood beneath the formations. Nor could it explain why witnesses separated by miles described the same geometry, the same slow, deliberate movement, the same vanishing into distance without a trace. In the years since, the Phoenix lights have been revisited by investigators, scientists, and skeptics alike. Some continue to argue for military projects, noting that the 1990s saw the development of stealth platforms still classified today. Others maintain that the size and behavior described place the objects outside the bounds of conventional technology. For those who were there, the memory remains vivid. Highways lined with cars pulled to the side, entire neighborhoods pointing skyward, pilots staring from their cockpits at structures that should not have been there, and instruments that insisted nothing was in the sky. The contradiction is at the heart of the mystery. Thousands saw something. Pilots logged encounters. Shadows crossed desert and city alike. And yet radar, the supposed final authority of the skies, recorded nothing at all. In aviation, absence of evidence is often the strongest evidence of all, for instruments rarely fail to confirm what eyes see. But in March 1997, over Phoenix, the instruments were silent while the sky was alive with forms that should not exist. For those who flew that night, the recollection is simple. Vast, triangular craft moving with deliberate grace, pacing their aircraft in silence. For those who stood on the ground, the memory is larger still. Black shapes blotting stars, glowing orbs tracing their undersides, the sense of being watched by something immense and unknowable. And for the official record, the radar log remains blank, a statement that nothing was there at all. The case of the Black Triangle over Phoenix endures not because of what it explains, but because of what it leaves unresolved. The coexistence of thousands of voices and the silence of instruments, the memory of colossal shadows and the blankness of official logs. The contradiction of a night when the sky itself seemed to hold corridors for something vast, silent, and unrecorded, something that crossed our airspace unseen yet witnessed by all who looked up. After Flight 401 crashed in 1972, crews on other Eastern Airlines flights reported seeing uniformed men in cockpits. Their descriptions matched the lost crew. Flight 401 was, at the time, a symbol of modern aviation safety. A Lockheed L-1011 TriStar considered among the most advanced aircraft of its era, equipped with sophisticated autopilot systems, redundancies, and spacious interiors designed to reassure passengers of the reliability of wide-body jet travel. On December 29, 1972, the flight departed New York's JFK Airport bound for Miami, with 176 passengers and 13 crew aboard. For most of the journey, the trip was uneventful, cruising smoothly toward Florida in clear conditions. As the jet approached Miami late that evening, the crew lowered the landing gear and noticed an anomaly. While two green indicator lights confirmed that the main landing gear had locked into place, the nose gear light remained dark. Believing the gear might have failed to deploy, Captain Robert Loft, First Officer Albert Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Don Repo began troubleshooting, focusing their attention on what they assumed was a technical problem. While the crew concentrated on the darkened bulb, the TriStar began to descend imperceptibly. Altimeters unwound, but distracted eyes remained fixed on the gear indicator panel. At 11:42 p.m., the jet struck the black waters of the Everglades, breaking apart and scattering wreckage across miles of swamp and sawgrass. Helicopters responded swiftly, guided by the flames visible from miles away, and rescue teams pulled survivors from the wreckage in the dark. But of the 176 aboard, 101 lost their lives, including Loft and Repo. The official investigation concluded that the cause was human error, a textbook example of fixation on a minor issue while critical flight parameters were ignored. Yet in the months that followed, a different story began to emerge. Eastern Airlines, eager to salvage value from the wreckage, recovered undamaged parts from the downed aircraft and installed them in other L-1011s in the fleet, a practical measure in an era when resources were tightly managed. It was after this that crew members began reporting encounters that could not be explained. Flight attendants whispered of uniformed men glimpsed in galley corridors, their presence so solid that attendants prepared to speak to them before the figures faded into nothing. Passengers described conversations with helpful crew members who had reassured them mid-flight, only to later discover that no such crew had been assigned. Most disturbing were the cockpit reports, with captains and first officers describing glancing across the flight deck and finding another man in uniform sitting quietly beside them, calm, watchful, instantly recognizable as Loft or Repo. These accounts were not vague shadows or fleeting tricks of the eye, but specific, consistent sightings described in the measured language of aviation logs. Repo was often seen in galleys or near ovens salvaged from the wreckage. One flight attendant claimed to have seen his reflection in the glass of an oven door, where he turned to her and clearly said, "There will be fire here, but you will be safe," only for a galley fire to break out hours later, quickly contained before it caused damage. Another report described Repo appearing in the cockpit of a departing flight, where he reassured a startled crew, telling them, "We will not let it happen again," before vanishing. Passengers with no knowledge of the crash sometimes described encounters that were later verified. In one case, a woman identified Repo's portrait among a group of Eastern Airlines crew photographs after insisting that he had helped her fasten her seatbelt mid-flight. Eastern Airlines management discouraged these stories, warning staff not to speak of them publicly for fear of damaging passenger confidence. But unofficially, the accounts circulated widely within the airline. Journalists and investigators began collecting testimonies, many from seasoned professionals whose reputations were built on precision and accuracy. John Fuller's book, The Ghost of Flight 401, compiled dozens of these accounts, preserving them before they could be quietly erased. Skeptics argued that the apparitions were the product of stress and grief, particularly among employees who had lost colleagues in the crash, but this explanation failed to account for passengers who recognized men they had never met. Others proposed collective suggestion, a spreading story magnified by fear and expectation, but that theory could not explain the warnings tied to malfunctions, nor why sightings consistently occurred in aircraft outfitted with salvaged parts and ceased once those parts were removed. Parapsychologists suggested that traumatic events can imprint themselves on physical objects, with the ovens, instruments, and fittings carrying a kind of residual memory that replayed fragments of the final flight in the form of apparitions. Whatever the cause, the reports were consistent and widespread enough to become one of the most famous haunted aircraft cases in history. For aviation as a whole, Flight 401 became a turning point. The accident highlighted the dangers of fixation error, leading to the widespread adoption of Crew Resource Management, or CRM, a system that trained pilots to distribute attention, delegate tasks, and maintain awareness even in moments of distraction. That legacy is still felt in cockpits around the world today. But for those who flew Eastern Airlines in the years immediately after the crash, the legacy was also spectral. The apparitions of Loft and Repo were never described as threatening. Instead, they appeared calm, reassuring, even protective, as though the men remained on duty, guiding their colleagues and passengers from beyond. Eventually, as salvaged parts were removed from service, the sightings faded, leaving only stories, testimonies, and folklore. For the airline, the apparitions were an embarrassment. For crews, they were quiet encounters never forgotten. And for passengers who saw them, they were glimpses of something unexplainable. Men who had died in the swamps of Florida, still wearing their uniforms, still working their flights. Today, Flight 401 is remembered both for its technical lessons and for the mystery it left behind. No radar ever registered the apparitions, no flight recorder captured their voices, but for a brief, uncanny period in the 1970s, Eastern Airlines aircraft carried more crew than their manifest declared. The official files close the case as human error. The folklore insists there was more, and among those who swear they saw loft and repo, the story remains not one of terror, but of presence men still at work, ensuring no one else would meet the fate they had endured. In 1969, a test flight over Nevada logged instruments freezing at 0 knots, though the aircraft cruised steadily. Engineers never reproduced the fault. The flight had been scheduled as part of a series of performance checks, routine evaluations in the dry, clear skies above the Nevada desert, where airspace was open and weather usually calm. The aircraft, a twin-engine jet designed for both military evaluation and potential civilian adaptation, lifted smoothly from the tarmac and climbed toward its assigned altitude, carrying a crew of test pilots and engineers accustomed to long, uneventful hours of monitoring dials and recording data. At 32.0 feet, the desert stretched below them in muted tones of sand and stone, broken by occasional mountain ridges. Conditions were perfect for the run, with visibility unlimited and winds light. The jet leveled off, engines droning with steady thrust, when something entirely unexpected occurred. Without warning, the airspeed indicator dropped. Not by degrees, not as a fluctuation, but suddenly, with the needle falling hard against the stop at 0 knots, as though the aircraft had lost all forward motion and were hanging motionless in the sky. Inside the cockpit, alarm rippled through the crew. Airspeed is among the most vital references a pilot has, more fundamental than fuel or navigation, the one measurement that defines whether wings can hold a plane in the sky. Yet when they looked outside, the desert floor slid past as smoothly as before. Clouds moved relative to the horizon, and the sensation of steady forward flight never faltered. The engines continued producing thrust, altitude held constant, and controls remained responsive. The paradox deepened when backup systems confirmed the same impossible reading. The aircraft, according to its instruments, was standing still at cruising altitude, yet by every sensory cue, it was pressing forward without difficulty. For several minutes, the jet seemed caught in a contradiction. Pilots monitored altimeters and vertical speed indicators, which showed stable flight. Engine pressure ratios and exhaust gas temperatures were normal. Fuel consumption remained within expected margins, and control surfaces responded exactly as commanded. The only failure lay in the airspeed, frozen in defiance of both physics and experience. Just as suddenly, the instrument came back to life. The needle lifted, swung upward, and steadied once more at the correct cruising speed. No turbulence marked the transition, no shift in sound or vibration suggested a correction, and nothing in the cockpit revealed why the anomaly had occurred. It was as though a curtain had briefly dropped between the aircraft and its own velocity, only to lift again without leaving a trace. Back on the ground, engineers assumed a pitot-static fault. Airspeed in most aircraft is measured by comparing pressure at the pitot tube on the fuselage against static ports measuring ambient air. Blockage by ice, insects, or debris can cause erroneous readings, and the TriStar's tragedy years later would remind the world of the dangers of pitot failure. But in Nevada's arid skies that day, ice was impossible. Inspections found no foreign matter in the sensors, no fault in the lines, no electrical error in the instrument itself. The system passed every bench test. Engineers shook their heads and recorded the anomaly as unexplained, likely a one-off. Yet weeks later, another crew flying the same route reported the same phenomenon. Again, at high altitude above the desert, their airspeed indicator collapsed to 0, remaining frozen for minutes while the aircraft cruised normally. Again, altimeters and gyros confirmed steady flight, and again, the anomaly cleared without cause. When the jet landed, its systems were once more clean. Pitot tubes were unobstructed, wiring showed continuity, and calibration matched perfectly. Nothing could explain the failure. With 2 reports in hand, engineers dug deeper. They proposed rare atmospheric conditions. Nevada's desert skies, while clear to the eye, often hide complex layers of temperature and pressure. Perhaps unusual stratification created pockets of still air that confused the pitot system, forcing a false reading of 0 motion. But this did not explain why altimeters, also tied to pressure systems, were unaffected, or why gyros remained true. Others proposed electromagnetic interference. Nevada was home to test ranges where radar and communication systems operated at high power. Perhaps concentrated signals had disrupted sensitive cockpit instruments, yet such interference would have affected radios or navigation receivers as well, not just the isolated airspeed indicators. Still others wondered if the phenomenon was not failure at all but a glimpse of something stranger. Pilots themselves described the sensation less as a malfunction and more as entering a zone, a corridor where instruments lost their tether to reality. They recalled no turbulence, no sound of disruption, only a peculiar calmness, as though they had flown into air that refused to register their motion. It was like flying into a bubble, one test pilot later recalled. Everything worked, everything felt normal, but the needles wouldn't move. For those minutes, speed didn't exist. Such language unsettled engineers, who preferred mechanical faults to metaphors. Yet in the cockpit, where instruments are trusted above senses, the contradiction left its mark. Airspeed is the measure of lift and stall margins, climb and descent rates, and every decision in flight depends on it. For it to vanish while flight continued smoothly suggested not merely a fault in sensors, but a hole in certainty itself. The Air Force logged the cases but issued no formal warning, reasoning that no accidents had resulted and no replicable cause could be found. But within pilot circles, the story circulated as a quiet caution, a reminder that even in controlled skies, there were places where physics seemed to blur. Some theorists, working at the margins of science, suggested that regions of electromagnetic flux caused by mineral-rich geology beneath the desert might create temporary anomalies in pressure differentials, wiping out airspeed readings. Others reached further, proposing that such zones represented null points, places where space itself bent slightly, masking movement as though the aircraft had momentarily slipped outside measurable velocity. Without evidence, these remained speculation, but for crews who experienced it, the memory lingered, the unnerving contradiction of steady motion outside the windows and a frozen zero inside the panel. After 1,969, reports of the phenomenon faded. No catastrophic accidents were linked to it, and as newer avionics replaced older mechanical systems, the archived cases became little more than footnotes in flight test records. Yet, among the pilots who flew them, the events never quite disappeared. They recalled the desert spread beneath their wings, the hum of engines steady, the calm of perfect air, and the one instrument that refused to acknowledge motion. The case of the missing airspeed indicator remains unresolved, not because it threatened lives, but because it undermined certainty. In aviation, instruments are the anchor, the translation of invisible forces into numbers and dials. For a crew to look at their panel and see speed itself erased was to glimpse a hole in the map of the sky, a place where motion continued but measurement failed, a place where aircraft pressed forward yet recorded no journey at all. Pilots passing the Azores report corridors of cloud opening suddenly, walls of mist stretching for miles. Instruments glitch, and clocks run minutes behind. The Azores, a cluster of volcanic islands in the mid-Atlantic, have long been known as waypoints for ships and later for aircraft, their isolated peaks rising abruptly from the ocean and serving as markers in otherwise empty seas. Weather here is notoriously unstable, shaped by colliding currents of warm tropical air and cold polar streams, and for centuries sailors told of sudden fog banks appearing without warning, enveloping masts and sails in opaque curtains that blotted out the horizon. When aviation routes expanded after the Second World War, pilots began encountering the same phenomena from above. But their reports contained details stranger than drifting fog. They described sudden corridors opening in the sky, perfectly straight channels of mist, bounded by walls so sheer they looked almost architectural, stretching for miles in either direction. Crews flying through these passages noted that the cloud formations did not behave like natural weather, which tends to swirl, break, and reform chaotically. Instead, the corridors resembled tunnels, as if carved deliberately through the atmosphere. At first, pilots assumed these were odd but natural products of wind shear or temperature layering, rare cloud streets formed by the meeting of opposing currents. But then came the anomalies inside. Crews consistently reported that instruments flickered or reset, compasses spun briefly, radio signals dropped into static, and onboard clocks sometimes emerged from the corridors, showing discrepancies of several minutes behind ground time. In aviation, where schedules and fuel calculations hinge on precision, such discrepancies were noted with unease. One of the earliest detailed accounts came from the 1950s, when a Pan Am Clipper flying west of Terceira Island entered one of these corridors. The captain later described the cloud walls as glowing faintly, as if infused with diffuse sunlight. They flew through the corridor for nearly 10 minutes at cruising altitude, only to discover upon exit that their chronometers lagged almost 6 minutes compared with air traffic control. Fuel calculations no longer matched the expected values, as though time had slipped, yet distance covered remained unchanged. Another report surfaced in the 1970s, this time from a TAP Air Portugal crew at 33,000 feet. Entering a corridor of mist, their radios degraded instantly into static, and altimeters briefly disagreed, one showing a sudden drop of 400 feet while the aircraft felt perfectly stable. Within moments, the readings reconciled themselves, but the incident was logged carefully by shaken crew. In 2001, a cargo pilot en route from Boston to Lisbon recounted flying into what he called a gate of fog that appeared suddenly in otherwise clear skies. Inside, his compass swung erratically, and the GPS froze entirely, leaving them momentarily blind to position. When they emerged, their onboard clock trailed ground records by 3 minutes, a minor detail in commercial scheduling but deeply unsettling in the context of aviation reliability. Meteorologists propose natural explanations. The Azores lie at a meteorological crossroads, where cold and warm currents constantly battle, producing sharp gradients in pressure and temperature. Such gradients can sculpt narrow formations of cloud, and electrical charges in unstable air might disrupt radio communications. Yet these theories falter when confronted with the consistent time discrepancies. Atmospheric science explains turbulence, storms, and static, but not clocks running minutes behind after emerging from a cloud corridor. Physicists have speculated on gravitational anomalies caused by the volcanic geology beneath the islands, tectonic activity creating fields strong enough to affect delicate instruments, but no survey has ever confirmed distortions of that magnitude. Folklore, however, has long suggested stranger explanations. Portuguese sailors once spoke of mist gates in these waters, passages where ships disappeared, sometimes reappearing days later with crews convinced only hours had passed. The aviation accounts seem to echo those older tales too closely for coincidence, as though the corridors represent something older than aircraft. Windows in the sky aligned with ancient maritime legends. Pilots who experience the phenomenon often speak not of danger but of unease. The corridors feel too straight, too precise, as though nature had been overruled. Inside, the calm is absolute, wind stilled, engines droning against walls of silent mist. Then come the glitches, a compass spin, a radio hiss, the unsettling glance at a clock that no longer matches ground time. On exiting, the sky returns to normal, clouds break into their familiar disarray, and instruments stabilize. Only the discrepancy remains, logged in quiet handwriting in flight journals. Aviation authorities list no official warnings, for thousands of flights cross the Azores region safely every year, but among crews, the stories circulate. They speak of sky corridors where time falters, of tunnels cut into cloud that seem to wait like gateways. The sky corridor over the Azores remains unresolved. Half weather pattern, half mystery, one of those footnotes in flight logs that resists closure. Perhaps the explanations are natural, quirks of pressure and current colliding over a volcanic seam. Perhaps they are echoes of old folklore, mist gates reimagined for the jet age. Or perhaps they are something more, passages not just through air, but through time itself, where a few minutes are lost in the steady hum of engines and the unblinking walls of mist. And for those who flew through them, the experience remains unforgettable. A sky that opened into corridors, instruments that faltered, and clocks that told them they had been somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary flight, somewhere where even the passage of minutes could not be trusted.